Introduction: we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, 2.1. Why courage? Why now? There is a kind of meeting most of us have sat in. The decision on the table is wrong ethically, strategically, practically wrong, and several people in the room know it. The silence that follows is not the silence of agreement. It is something else, the sound of people who have done the calculation and concluded that speaking is not worth the cost. The meeting ends. The decision stands. Everyone knows what happened, and no one says so. That silence is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of courage. We live in an age saturated with talk of boldness. Leadership books invoke it on their covers. Commencement speeches invoke it in their peroration. Social media celebrates it in the form of opinions that cost their authors nothing. And yet the quiet room, the moment when someone should speak and doesn't, when someone should act and waits, remains as common as it has ever been. We are, in some respects, a culture that admires courage in the abstract and struggles to practice it in the particular. This gap is not hypocrisy. It is confusion. We have not examined the thing carefully enough to know what we are asking of ourselves when we ask it. Courage matters because nothing else works without it. Wisdom that is never spoken is only private comfort. Justice that is never defended is only an opinion. Love that is never risked is only sentiment. The ancient philosophers understood this with a clarity we have largely misplaced. Peter Geach, the 20th century philosopher, put it plainly: courage is a necessary condition for all the other virtues. Without it, they are merely held as beliefs rather than lived as commitments. Geach, 1977, page 160. Alastair MacIntyre, writing in After Virtue, made the same point from a different angle. A person who knows what is right but lacks the courage to do it does not, in any meaningful sense, know it, not yet, not fully. MacIntyre, 1981, page 192. Courage is the hinge. Turn it, and the other virtues open. Leave it closed, and they remain possibilities rather than realities. This book examines courage carefully. Not as a motivational category. Not as a synonym for boldness or risk tolerance or competitive fire. But as what it has always been, a specific virtue, with a history, a structure, a range of forms, and a set of conditions under which it fails. We are not the first to examine it this carefully. The tradition that runs from Socrates through Aristotle, the Stoics, and into the best of modern psychology and philosophy is extraordinarily rich. We mean to draw on all of it. We also mean to be honest about the complications. Courage is not simple. It is confused, in popular usage, with recklessness, the person who acts without counting the cost. It is confused with fearlessness, the fantasy of a person who has somehow escaped the human experience of being afraid. It is confused with stubbornness, the person who endures not because the thing is worth enduring but because changing course would require admitting they were wrong. None of these is courage, though all of them can look like it from a distance. The examination matters. How to read this book? This is not a self-help book, in the narrow sense. We are not offering a 10-step program for becoming a braver person. We are offering something different and we think, in the long run, more useful. We are offering a philosophical and practical inquiry into a virtue every reader already has some version of, carried out the way Socrates carried out his inquiries, by asking questions carefully, sitting with the discomfort of not yet knowing, and following the argument where it leads. The book is built around 10 questions about courage. Not answers given up front, but questions worked through together. Each chapter takes one question: what is courage? Can it be learned? When does it become foolish? And brings the full weight of classical philosophy, modern psychology, and lived human experience to bear on it. Each chapter moves through 3 distinct phases. The first, the question explored, opens with a historical scene or concrete case and then traces the question through the classical tradition, weaving through the key thinkers who shaped our understanding. The second, modern lens, bridges from the ancient to the contemporary, drawing on psychology, neuroscience, and leadership research to show where the old arguments hold and where our understanding has been refined or extended. The third, courage in action, turns the inquiry toward practice-specific, concrete, tested tools for bringing the chapter's argument into the life you are actually living. The book can be read straight through, and the chapters are designed to build on one another. But each chapter is also written to stand on its own. If a particular question is pressing for you right now, if you are in a leadership role confronting question 7, or facing your own mortality and reaching for question 9, you can begin there without having lost the thread. The questions are designed to be entered from any door. What we ask of the reader is not agreement. We ask engagement. The Socratic method, on which much of this inquiry is modeled, does not deliver verdicts. It delivers clarity. It shows you the shape of the question more precisely than you saw it before, and it hands that clarity to you to use as you see fit. That is our ambition here. A map of the 10 questions. The 10 questions in this book are not random. They form an arc, from definition through development, from the spectrum of failure to the domain of practical application, and finally to the legacy a courageous life leaves behind. Chapter 1 asks, what is courage? Before we can cultivate a virtue, we need to know what it is. We begin where Plato began, in the Laches, where 2 Athenian generals discover that they cannot define the thing they have spent their lives practicing. We follow the question through Aristotle's formulation, courage as the mean between cowardice and recklessness, and forward through the etymology that reveals what the word has always meant at its root, the willingness to act from the heart. Chapter 2 asks, is courage a virtue or a skill? Can it be taught, or is it innate? Aristotle argued for habituation. We become brave by acting bravely, badly at first, until the right responses become second nature. Modern psychology, and particularly the neuroscience of fear, has given this ancient argument empirical grounding. We examine where they converge and what their convergence means for how we develop. Chapter 3 asks, what is the opposite of courage? The obvious answer is cowardice. But Aristotle identified a second opposite, equally dangerous and far less often named, recklessness. Courage is not a line with cowardice at one end and unlimited boldness at the other. It is a 3-point structure, with courage at the center and 2 kinds of failure on either side. Understanding both failures is essential to understanding the virtue itself. Chapter 4 asks, can courage be learned? The Stoics thought so. Marcus Aurelius prepared for difficulty every morning, not as a ritual but as training. Modern neuroscience agrees, the pathways of fear response are plastic, and deliberate exposure reshapes them. Courage is not bestowed. It is built. Chapter 5 asks, when is courage foolish? Courage without wisdom is not a virtue at all. Aristotle's word for the practical intelligence that courage requires is phronesis, the ability to perceive, in real circumstances with real stakes, what is actually worth doing. We examine the cases where courage tips into recklessness, where conviction becomes dogmatism, and where the willingness to act outpaces the wisdom to act well. Chapter 6 asks, what is quiet courage? Not all courage announces itself. Moral courage, the courage of the person who does the right thing with no audience, no recognition, no record, is perhaps the form we encounter most often in an ordinary life, and the form the classical tradition was least equipped to describe. We examine the everyday acts, the sustained endurances, the silences maintained at great cost, and the moments when doing nothing visible takes everything a person has. Chapter 7 asks, how does courage shape leadership? The leader who cannot have a hard conversation cannot lead. The executive who cannot hold a position under pressure will be moved by whoever is loudest. We examine what courage looks like in positions of authority, the courageous conversation, conviction under fire, and the paradox. Brené Brown has documented that the willingness to be vulnerable is not a weakness in leadership but one of its essential strengths. Brown, 2018, page 11. Chapter 8 asks, what is the courage to think differently? Socrates went before the jury of Athens and refused to recant. He could have saved his life and did not, because what was at stake was not his life but his integrity as a thinker. Intellectual courage, the willingness to hold an unpopular position, to dissent from received wisdom, to follow an argument wherever it leads regardless of where it arrives, is one of the forms of courage most urgently needed in any age and most quietly suppressed. Chapter 9 asks, how does courage face mortality? Seneca wrote his final letters knowing Nero's order could arrive at any moment and wrote them with absolute calm. Paul Tillich called this the courage to be, the act of affirming one's own existence in the face of non-existence. Every other form of courage in this book is, in some sense, a preparation for this one. Chapter 10 asks, what is the legacy of a courageous life? Aristotle's word for human flourishing is eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but better understood as the full actualization of what a human being is capable of being. A courageous life is not a dramatic life, or a famous one, or an easy one. It is a life that has been fully inhabited, that has not flinched at the moments when flinching was easy, and has not charged when prudence counseled patience. It is, in the deepest sense, a life that has been lived. The arc of the 10 questions moves from definition to development, from the spectrum of failure to the domain of practice, from the special forms courage takes in leadership, thought, and mortality, to the question of what all of it adds up to at the end. Each question is complete in itself. Together, they compose a portrait. The reader's invitation. This book is for anyone who has felt the pull of something they knew they should do but hadn't done yet. The conversation postponed. The position not taken. The creative work not started. The truth not spoken to the person who most needed to hear it. If any of those ring with any degree of recognition, this book is for you. We have 2 audiences in mind, and we have tried to honor both of them throughout. For leaders, whether of organizations, teams, families, or movements, this book offers philosophical grounding for the kinds of decisions that cannot be made well without it. The courage required in a position of authority is specific and can be studied. The history of how human beings have thought about it is longer, richer, and more practically useful than most leadership literature acknowledges. We have tried to make that history accessible and immediately applicable. For readers who come to this book as philosophical or academic inquiry, those who have encountered courage in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or in the Laches and want to follow the question further, we have tried to do the question justice. The history of courage as a philosophical concept is as contested and as rich as any question in the tradition. Plato's failed definitions in the Laches are a genuinely unresolved philosophical problem. Aristotle's account has been refined, challenged, and extended, but not replaced. The modern conversation, from Rachman to Brown to Frankl, has genuine philosophical depth. We have tried to honor that depth while keeping the argument moving. Both audiences share something, an honest interest in the question. That is the only credential required. Somewhere in Athens, in the late 5th century, 2 generals sat with a philosopher and tried to say what courage was. They failed, in the specific sense that no definition survived Socrates' questioning. But the attempt was not wasted. It sharpened the question. It revealed the shape of what they were looking for. It left all of them, one suspects, better positioned to recognize courage the next time they saw it or failed to. That is what the first chapter offers, and what the rest of the book builds upon. Let us begin. What is courage? Part 1. The question explored in the late 5th century BCE. 2 Athenian generals sat together after the campaign in Sicily. They are still thick with the dust of war, the casualty lists not yet written out. One of them, Laches, had seen a soldier do something extraordinary that day. The man had held his line when the line was breaking. He had stood when standing made no military sense. He had, in the language his commanders would later use in their reports, displayed Andreia, courage, manliness, the virtue of the soldier. But what had they actually seen? That is the question Plato lets Socrates put to Laches in the dialogue that bears the general's name. They have come together, ostensibly, to advise 2 fathers on whether their sons should be trained in the new art of armored combat. The conversation drifts, as Socratic conversations tend to, from the practical question to the deeper one beneath it. Before we can train a young man in courage, we ought to know what courage actually is. It is a humbling moment. Laches has spent his life in battle. He has watched men die well and men die badly. He has, by any reasonable measure, more direct experience of courage than any philosopher in Athens. And yet when Socrates asks him for a definition, not an example, not a story, but a definition that would hold across every case, Laches stumbles. His first attempt is a portrait. Courage is the soldier who stays in his rank and fights the enemy without running away. Socrates politely pushes back. What about the Scythian cavalry, who fight by retreating and turning to shoot? What about a sailor in a storm? What about courage in poverty, in politics, in resisting pleasure? Surely all of these are courage too. Laches concedes the point and tries again. This time he offers something broader, courage is a certain endurance of soul, carteria tis tes psyches. The capacity to hold on. To not give way. This is closer, and Socrates honors the attempt. But then he asks a question that has the quality of a small explosion. Is all endurance courageous? What about a foolish endurance, a man who spends his money he doesn't have, persisting in a bad bet? What about endurance without intelligence behind it? Socrates lets the image hang in the air. A stubborn mule is enduring. A man who refuses to listen to good counsel is enduring. We would not call either of them courageous. So endurance cannot be the whole of it. There must be something else, some wisdom, some discernment about what is worth enduring and why. Nicias, the other general, has been listening. He is more philosophical than Laches, more comfortable with the abstractions Socrates loves. He offers his own definition, drawn from the teaching of Socrates himself. Courage is knowledge of the fearful and the hopeful, knowledge of what is genuinely to be feared and what is genuinely to be hoped for. The courageous person, on this view, is the one who sees clearly. He fears what is truly terrible. He hopes for what is truly good. And he acts from that clear sight. It is an elegant definition, and Socrates plays with it for a while before quietly dismantling it. If courage is the knowledge of what is fearful and hopeful, then it is just a species of knowledge, and knowledge of good and evil more broadly is what the Greeks called sophia, wisdom. But that would make courage indistinguishable from the whole of virtue. A definition that swallows everything it was meant to distinguish has failed. The dialogue ends in what scholars call aporia, the productive Socratic dead end, where the question remains, sharper now, but unanswered. What Plato leaves us with is not a definition of courage but a clarified problem. Courage cannot be reduced to mere endurance, because endurance without wisdom is stubbornness. It cannot be reduced to mere knowledge, because knowledge without the willingness to act in fear is only a kind of philosophy. The thing we are looking for sits somewhere between the body's steadiness and the mind's clarity. It needs both. Aristotle, Plato's most consequential student, took up the problem where the Laches had abandoned it. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, 350 BC, 3.69, he offered the formulation that would shape Western moral thought for the next 2,000 years. Courage, he argued, is a mean. It sits between two failures, and its character is defined by what it stands between. On one side is the failure of deficiency, cowardice. The coward feels more fear than the situation warrants and acts on it, fleeing what he ought to face. On the other side, less obvious but no less a failure, is the excess, rashness, or recklessness. The reckless person does not feel enough fear. He charges where he should pause. He confuses absence of fear with presence of virtue. Aristotle is precise here in a way that cuts against modern cliché. The soldier who charges the line because he doesn't register the danger is not brave. He is rash. He may even be useful. Armies have always benefited from men who don't think clearly about risk, but he is not exhibiting the virtue we mean when we speak of courage. The courageous person, on Aristotle's account, feels the fear that the situation warrants. He sees the danger for what it is. And he acts anyway, because the action is the right one to take. He feels what Aristotle calls appropriate confidence, confidence calibrated to the genuine prospects of the action, and he proceeds. Crucially for Aristotle, this is not a one-time performance. Courage is a hexis, a stable disposition of character, built up over time through repeated right action. You become courageous the way you become a fluent speaker of a language, not by reading about it, but by speaking it, badly at first, until the right responses become second nature. This calibration, knowing which dangers are worth facing, and when, and how, is what Aristotle calls phronesis, practical wisdom, the indispensable companion of every virtue. It is worth pausing on the word itself. The Greek andreia literally means manliness, which betrays the dialogue's martial setting. For the Greeks of the 5th century, the paradigm case of courage was the citizen soldier in the phalanx. The Latin fortitudo, by which Cicero and later Aquinas would render the concept, means strength, but in its full sense, strength of soul, the capacity to bear and to act. Our English word travels from a different route entirely. Courage comes through Old French courage from the Latin cor, heart. To act with courage is to act from the heart, not in the soft, sentimental sense the phrase has acquired, but in the older sense of the heart as the seat of one's deepest commitments. Courage, etymologically, is the willingness to let what is most central in you govern what you do, especially when fear is whispering otherwise. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, took the classical inheritance and added a distinction that has proven enduringly useful. Fortitude, he wrote in the Summa Theologica, Aquinas, 1274, 123 quetzales, has two acts. One is attack, facing danger and going forward into it, the courage of the soldier advancing, the activist speaking up, the founder placing the bet. The other is endurance, bearing what cannot be changed, the courage of the sick person who refuses to despair, the prisoner who keeps faith, the parent who shoulders the long, unromantic work of raising a difficult child. Of the two, Aquinas argued, endurance is the higher act. Attack is sudden, endurance is sustained. Attack happens in a moment, endurance is the same moment held open, hour after hour, day after day, until the danger passes or the soul gives out. This is the refined classical answer, drawn from Plato through Aristotle and into Aquinas. Courage is a virtuous disposition, a stable trait of character, to face genuine fear for a noble purpose, holding the mean between cowardice and recklessness, expressing itself in both the willingness to attack and the deeper willingness to endure. It is not a feeling. It is not a moment. It is what you have made of yourself, tested at the moment when something worth defending is at stake. The man who faces and who fears the right things and from the right motive, in the right way and at the right time, and who feels confidence under the corresponding conditions, is brave. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, 3.9, Part 2, Modern Lens. If you took Aristotle by the shoulders and walked him through a modern bookstore, past the self-help shelves, past the leadership titles, past the memoirs with the word fearless on their covers, he would be puzzled. Not by the volume of writing on courage, the ancients also wrote a great deal about it. He would be puzzled by what he kept reading on those covers. Fearless. No fear. Conquering fear. The modern conception, at its most popular, often imagines courage as the absence of fear, as if the courageous person were a kind of psychological superhero who has burned out the circuitry of anxiety and now walks into the burning building feeling nothing in particular. To Aristotle, this would not describe a virtue. It would describe a defect. The person who genuinely feels nothing in the face of real danger is not brave, he is missing a faculty most of us possess for a reason. Fear is information. It tells you that something matters, that something is at risk, that the situation in front of you is not trivial. To extinguish it entirely would not make you courageous, it would make you reckless, or dissociated, or both. The modern thinkers who have studied courage most carefully have, interestingly, circled back to something very close to Aristotle's position. Stanley Rachman, a British clinical psychologist, spent decades studying people who do dangerous work for a living: bomb disposal officers, paratroopers, firefighters. His book Fear and Courage, Rachman, 1990, page 2, documented something that those professionals already knew from experience. The most effective among them, the ones who lasted, the ones whose hands stayed steady on the wires, were not the ones who felt no fear. They were the ones who felt fear and acted well in spite of it. Rachman's working definition, distilled from years of empirical observation, is almost a paraphrase of Aristotle: courage is persistence in approach behavior despite the experience of fear. Action in the presence of fear, not the absence of it. Brené Brown, the research professor whose work on shame and vulnerability has reached an audience the ancient philosophers would have envied, has taken this insight and pressed on it from a different angle. In Daring Greatly, Brown, 2012, page 12, and Dare to Lead, Brown, 2018, page 11, she argues that courage has a far wider range than our martial vocabulary suggests. The courage to be vulnerable. The courage to tell the truth about who you are. The courage to enter a conversation you have been avoiding. Courage is telling our story with our whole heart, she writes, and the word's own etymology vindicates her. Courage. From core heart. There is a kind of courage, she has spent her career documenting, that never makes it onto the battlefield because its battlefield is the dinner table, the therapy office, the difficult email, the moment in a meeting when you raise your hand and risk being wrong in public. This is not a softening of the classical concept. It is an extension of it into domains the classical authors largely ignored. Ryan Holiday, in Courage is Calling, Holiday, 2021, page 3, draws this line explicitly. The call to courage, he writes, is everywhere, not just at Thermopylae or on the deck of a sinking ship, but in boardrooms, in classrooms, in the small, daily, almost invisible decisions where one option is the brave one and the other is the convenient one. The structure of the call has not changed since antiquity. There is a thing that needs doing. There is a fear that argues against doing it. There is a purpose that pulls you forward, if you are willing to be pulled. The setting has changed, the architecture is identical. Where do the ancient and modern accounts converge? On at least 3 points. First, courage is always relational to fear. It makes no sense to speak of courage where nothing is at stake and nothing is feared. Second, courage requires a worthy purpose. An action taken without one is either bravado or foolishness, but not virtue. Third, courage is not the same thing as recklessness. The failure modes the ancients identified are still the failure modes today. Where do they diverge? Mostly in scope. Aristotle's paradigm case was the soldier in battle, and his treatment of courage outside the martial sphere was glancing at best. Modern thinkers from Brown, 2012, page 12, to Holiday, 2021, page 3, have insisted that the same virtue operates wherever a human being is asked to act against fear for the sake of something worth acting for. The emotional courage to tell the truth. The creative courage to make something and let it be seen. The relational courage to stay in a hard conversation rather than walk out of it. These are all, in the modern view, expressions of the same underlying virtue. The classical authors might have called some of them by other names. We are no longer obliged to. Reflection prompt: think of a time you acted despite fear. What made it feel like courage rather than recklessness, and what was the worthy purpose that pulled you forward? Part 3, Courage in Action. Before you can practice courage, you need to know what you are actually practicing. This is not an academic point. Most people who struggle with courage do not struggle from a lack of willingness, they struggle because they have been working from a confused definition. They think courage means feeling no fear, so they wait for the fear to disappear before they act, and the fear never disappears, so they never act. Or they think courage means doing anything dramatic, so they confuse impulsiveness with bravery and end up regretting actions that were never really brave to begin with. Naming a thing precisely gives you power over it. So, be precise. The classical and modern accounts agree on the shape. Courage is acting well in the presence of appropriate fear, for a purpose worth the risk. Here are 4 practices that flow directly from that definition. Try them this week. Practice 1, name your fear explicitly. Vagueness amplifies fear, precision shrinks it. I'm anxious about the presentation is a fog. I'm afraid that I'll stumble over my words in front of the VP and confirm her suspicion that I'm not ready for the next role is a sentence. The sentence is workable. The fog is paralyzing. When you find yourself avoiding something, stop and write down the fear in one specific sentence. Name the person, the outcome, the stakes. Bring the fear into language. Most fears lose some of their power the moment they are forced to speak in complete sentences. Practice 2, apply the mean test. Before acting, ask yourself 2 questions in sequence. Am I about to be cowardly avoiding what genuinely needs doing because it frightens me? Or am I about to be reckless acting without sufficient thought, mistaking adrenaline for clarity? Courage lives between those 2 failures. Aristotle's word for the faculty that makes this judgment in real time is phronesis, practical wisdom. It is not a rule you can memorize. It is a question you can ask every time until asking it becomes habitual. Practice 3, ask is this the right thing to do, before is this safe to do? The order of these questions matters more than people realize. Safety is not the primary question that courage asks. Purpose is. If you lead with is this safe, you will find 1,000 reasons that nothing ever is, and you will spend a life in well-considered retreat. If you lead with is this the right thing to do, you may still decide not to do it. Discernment is part of courage too, but you will have asked the question in the right order. The right question makes the right decision possible. Practice 4, study one courageous person this week. Pick someone, from history, from your field, from your own life. It can be a famous figure or a quiet colleague whose conduct you have always admired. Spend 20 minutes with them. Ask 2 questions. What did they face? And why did they act? Look not for the moment of action but for the purpose behind it. Courage is almost never about the dramatic instant, it is about the long alignment of a life with something worth being aligned to. Studying that alignment in someone else is one of the most efficient ways to begin recognizing it in yourself. These 4 practices are not a checklist for becoming brave. They are tools for clarifying, in the small moments of an ordinary week, whether what you are about to do or avoid doing has the shape of courage or one of its counterfeits. Used regularly, they begin to do what Aristotle said the virtues do, they become habitual. The questions ask themselves. The fear gets named without effort. The mean is sensed before it is calculated. And one day you find that you have acted bravely without thinking about it, because the thinking has been done over years, in 1,000 small rehearsals. Philosopher Spotlight, Aristotle 384 to 322 BCE, studied under Plato for 20 years and later tutored Alexander the Great, but built a moral philosophy entirely his own. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he argued that virtues are not innate gifts or sudden inspirations but stable dispositions cultivated through repeated practice. On courage specifically, he was unusually precise. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the right response to it. The truly courageous person feels appropriate fear, this is healthy, rational, and informative, and chooses to act anyway for a worthy purpose. The reckless person doesn't feel enough fear, the coward feels too much. Courage is the precise calibration between them, learned only by living it. Courage challenge: write down one decision you have been avoiding. Underneath it, name the specific fear that is stopping you, and write one sentence, the worthy purpose that would justify facing it. Then share the page with one person, a colleague, a mentor, a friend, and ask them to check in with you in 3 days. Is courage a virtue or a skill? Part 1, the question explored. He was 22 years old on his first deployment, and he could not stop shaking. Not the visible trembling of the coward breaking rank, he held his position, he followed his orders, he did what was asked of him. But inside, in the place no training manual ever quite reaches, everything was vibrating. He was certain he was not brave. He was certain the men around him were made of something he was not made of, that the sergeant who moved through gunfire with that terrifying quietness had access to some biological resource he himself had been denied. He got through that tour. He got through a second. A decade later, the same man sat in a briefing room during an active crisis and noticed something strange. He was the calmest person there. The panic that was flashing through the others was absent in him, not suppressed, not performed away, but simply not arriving with the same force. The fear was still present, but it had been metabolized. It no longer owned the room inside his chest. So here is the question that his case puts to us, and it is not a trivial one. Is that man now courageous? Or is he simply well-trained, skilled at managing fear the way a surgeon is skilled at managing a scalpel, the way a pilot is skilled at reading instruments in turbulence? Because if he is courageous, we want to know how that happened, and whether it can be made to happen deliberately. But if he is merely skilled, then we are talking about something considerably different, something that belongs to the domain of performance, expertise, and technique rather than the domain of character and virtue. The question matters because skill and virtue are not the same thing, and the difference has consequences for how we understand what we are building when we try to become braver. Aristotle was the first philosopher to examine this distinction with the precision it deserves. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, 350 BCE, 2.4, he draws a careful line between technique, craft, skill, know-how and arete, virtue. The line is not drawn at the level of action. A skilled practitioner and a virtuous person can perform exactly the same act from the outside. The line is drawn at the level of what is happening inside the act. A skill, Aristotle explains, requires only the right action. Produce the right outcome, through the right technique, and the skill is demonstrated. A cobbler who makes a good shoe is skilled, even if he makes it angrily, or carelessly, or for a customer he despises. The quality of the shoe is not affected by the quality of the cobbler's soul. Virtue is different. Aristotle is explicit: for an act to count as virtuous, 3 things must be present simultaneously. The agent must do the right thing. They must feel what is appropriate to feel, the right emotional response, in the right measure, toward the right object. And they must act for the right purpose. All 3, together. The action alone is not enough. A gifted actor playing Hamlet's father's ghost is technically producing false statements with great skill, but no one calls him dishonest, because the purpose and emotional register of the act are entirely different from deception. Conversely, a person who tells a difficult truth and does so with contempt, or for the purpose of humiliating the person they are telling, has not performed a virtuous act simply because what they said was accurate. Applied to courage, the implication is sharp. A soldier who holds his line because he is more afraid of his commanding officer than of the enemy, or because the neural circuits for fear have simply not fired, has not performed a courageous act in Aristotle's sense. He has performed a technically correct act. What is missing is the interior structure, the appropriate fear, the clarity about purpose, the disposition to act for the right reasons. The action without that structure is not courage. It is something else that looks like courage from the outside. And yet Aristotle does not leave it there. Because he is a philosopher interested in how virtue is actually acquired by actual human beings. In Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he advances what has become one of the most cited arguments in the entire history of ethics: we become virtuous by doing virtuous acts. The Greek is elegant ethos, character, from ethos, habit, two words that differ by a single vowel, pointing to the single most important fact about moral development. We do not arrive at courage by contemplating courage. We arrive at courage by acting courageously, however imperfectly, until the actions form what Aristotle calls a hexis, a stable, settled disposition that has become genuinely part of who we are. Not what we do, but what we are. The musician has a skill, the courageous person has a self. This is where the argument becomes both subtle and important. Because Aristotle's habituation thesis sounds, at first hearing, very much like a skill development thesis. Train the behavior until it becomes automatic. Repeat until mastery. This is precisely how we build skills. And yet Aristotle is insistent that the end point of the process is not a skill but a virtue, not a technique but a character. The difference is in what is being formed. Skill formation shapes your capacity to produce certain outcomes. Virtue formation shapes your desires, what you want, what you fear, what moves you, what you are willing to do for the sake of what. The habituated acts do not just teach your body what to do, they reshape the person inside the body. That reshaping is what Aristotle means by character, and it cannot be faked. Plato had already anticipated the question a generation earlier. In the Protagoras, one of the most dramatically alive of the dialogues, Socrates encounters the great sophist who has made a distinguished career of teaching virtue to young men for a considerable fee. Protagoras is confident, virtue, including courage, is transmitted by culture, by parents, by teachers, by the laws themselves. The entire city is engaged in virtue education from the moment a child is born. Socrates is skeptical, and his skepticism is pointed. If virtue were simply teachable the way arithmetic is teachable, why do the sons of the most virtuous men in Athens so consistently fail to inherit their father's courage? Pericles trained his sons with extraordinary care and vast resources. His sons were not Pericles. Why not? The problem, Socrates suggests, is that virtue cannot be poured from one person into another the way information can. Something in the recipient must be prepared to receive it, some willingness to be formed, some orientation of the will that no teacher can simply install. This is not a counsel of despair about moral education. It is a clarification of what kind of thing virtue is. It is not inert knowledge waiting to be received. It is a living configuration of a human character, and it requires the person whose character is at stake to be an active participant in its formation. Thomas Aquinas, the great synthesizer of classical and Christian moral thought, added a distinction that carries the argument another step forward. In the Summa Theologica, Aquinas, 1274, III 55 Quetzales, he distinguishes between virtues that are infused, given by divine grace, not earned, and virtues that are acquired, built up through repeated human acts over time. The acquired virtues, which include the courage of the ordinary human being working through ordinary human difficulty, are not mere skills precisely because they require what Aquinas calls right appetite. It is not enough to know how to face danger, the virtuous person must want to face it for the right reasons, and that wanting must be ordered, calibrated not to self-interest, to reputation, to fear of disgrace, but to genuine goodness. Fortitude, as Aquinas understands it, is not the technique of a trained professional, it is the rightly ordered will of a person who has come to genuinely care about the things worth caring about. The resolution toward which all three thinkers point us is this: courage begins in something that resembles skill. The young soldier's early tours look, from the inside, more like performance than virtue, doing the right thing, imperfectly, without yet having the emotional calibration that would make the action fully courageous in Aristotle's sense. But over time, if the acts are performed with some degree of reflection and genuine purpose, something more than skill is formed. The disposition deepens. The right emotional responses become more natural. The purpose becomes more fully internalized. And the person who arrives on the other side of that process is not merely better at managing fear, they are differently constituted. Their courage is theirs, in the way that their convictions and their affections are theirs, not as an external capacity but as an expression of who they have become. Courage is both, in sequence, skill-like at first, virtue in the end. We become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, 2.1, Part 2, Modern lends the argument between skill and virtue did not end with Aquinas. It simply migrated. What philosophy debated in the language of techne and errate, contemporary psychology debates in the language of trait theory versus growth mindset, fixed character versus acquired habit, hardwired personality versus learnable behavior. The terms have changed. The underlying question, what kind of thing is courage, and can it be deliberately developed, is the same question Plato was putting to Protagoras in the 5th century BCE. Angela Duckworth has done more than almost any researcher of her generation to make the case for the learnable side. Her work on grit, which she defines as passion combined with perseverance toward long-term goals, grew out of a puzzle not unlike the one Aristotle was solving: why do some people persist through difficulty while others of equal or greater intelligence give up? In Grit, Duckworth, 2016, page 8, she argues that character strengths, including the kind of courageous persistence that looks, from the outside, like sheer willpower, can be measured, cultivated, and taught. Her studies of KIPP schools, charter schools built on the explicit premise that character is as teachable as mathematics, showed that students trained in persistence, self-control, and grit demonstrated measurable improvement in precisely those traits. This is powerful evidence for the skill side of the argument. If Duckworth is right, courage-adjacent behaviors are not fixed personality traits distributed by birth lottery, they are capacities that respond to deliberate development. Neuroscience has begun to tell the same story in a different language. Repeated exposure to fear, managed exposure, in contexts that do not overwhelm the regulatory system, strengthens the prefrontal cortex's capacity to modulate amygdala activity. Fear pathways, sensitized by repeated alarm, can be desensitized through repeated, successful navigation of the feared situation. Executive control, the neural infrastructure of deliberate action in the face of powerful impulse, is not fixed at birth, it is exercised. Habituation, in the language of cognitive neuroscience, looks remarkably like what Aristotle described as the mechanism of virtue formation in 350 BCE. We are not the first generation to discover that character is built through practice. We are merely the first to watch it happen under an fMRI. But here is where the modern evidence becomes interesting rather than simply confirmatory. Duckworth herself is careful to note that grit, perseverance, in the absence of direction can become pathology. The person who persists tirelessly toward the wrong goal, or toward no goal at all but simply because giving up is uncomfortable, has not developed a virtue. They have developed a compulsion. The skill is present, the virtue is absent. Brené Brown, whose research on shame, vulnerability, and courage has reached an audience the ancient philosophers would have found astonishing, makes this point with particular force in Dare to Lead, Brown, 2018, page 11. The courageous behaviors she has spent her career documenting, speaking honestly in difficult conversations, setting clear boundaries, naming what is uncomfortable rather than smoothing it over, can absolutely be practiced deliberately and become more natural over time. She has built an entire training curriculum on exactly that premise. But Brown is careful about the foundation: the behaviors must arise from values, not just habit. Courage practiced in the absence of genuine care about the right things is not courage, it is the performance of courage, which is a form of manipulation no less troubling for being unconscious. This is where the ancient insight cuts through the modern evidence most sharply. A person who has developed the skill of appearing brave through trained behavior, carefully rehearsed responses, practiced confidence, without the underlying virtue of genuinely caring about the right things, is not courageous in any sense that matters. Aristotle had a name for this: acting from the right external motion without the right internal state, the action correct, the virtue absent. The modern reader encounters this type frequently enough: the executive who speaks boldly in every meeting but has never once told a truth that cost them anything, the leader whose risk-taking is calibrated precisely to the reputational payoff. The skill is real. The virtue is not. Where do ancient and modern converge most compellingly? On the necessity of practice. Neither Aristotle nor Duckworth believes you can think your way to courage. Both insist that the doing comes first, and that character follows from the doing rather than preceding it. This is not a small agreement. It is a fundamental claim about human development, that we are not born into our character, we grow into it, and the growth happens through action. Where they must be read together rather than separately is on the question of purpose. Duckworth gives us the mechanism: perseverance, passion, practice. Aristotle and Brown together give us the orientation, the why that must accompany the what, without which we have built technique without character. Skill without character is competence. Virtue is competence that has become identity, directed by genuine care toward things genuinely worth caring about. Reflection prompt: are you treating courage as a fixed trait, something you either have or don't, or as a disposition you are actively building through practice? What would change if you treated every act of courage, however small, as a deposit into your character? Part 3: Courage in Action. The distinction between skill and virtue is not just philosophical furniture. It changes what you do this week, in a specific and practical way. If courage were only a skill, you could simply train the behavior, expose yourself to fear, repeat until automatic, and call it done. But because courage is virtue information, the practices that build it have to do two things at once: repeat the behavior, and attend to the purpose behind it. Technique and character, together, every time. Here are 3 practices that take both seriously. Practice 1: start a courage log. Each day for 30 days, write down one act that required you to move toward something that frightened you, however small. The email you finally sent. The disagreement you named. The boundary you held. The ask you made. The conversation you did not walk away from. The log does 2 things simultaneously. It makes invisible acts visible, and courage, in ordinary life, is almost always invisible, which is precisely why most people do not recognize their own. And it builds a record that proves to you, against your own doubts and the revisionist tendencies of discouragement, that you are capable of courage. Aristotle said we become what we repeatedly do. The log is the proof of what you are becoming. Practice 2: seek one uncomfortable conversation per week. Not a crisis conversation that comes looking for you, a deliberately chosen one. Pick the topic you have been sidestepping with a colleague, a partner, a direct report, a friend. Enter it prepared and curious, not armed and defensive. This is the practice field. Athletes do not get strong only by playing games, they train deliberately, in conditions they control. One honest, slightly uncomfortable conversation per week, chosen in advance, entered with intention, reflected on afterward, builds more moral courage over the course of a year than any crisis ever could. The crisis tests what you have already built. The practice builds what you will have when the next crisis arrives. Practice 3: reflect weekly on the why of your courageous acts. After each entry in your courage log, add one line: why did I do this? Not the narrative justification, the real answer. Was it genuine virtue, the right thing done for the right reason? Or was it habit, social pressure, ego, the desire to be seen as the kind of person who acts bravely? The skill of courage and the virtue of courage look identical from the outside. Only you can tell the difference from the inside. Weekly reflection on the why is how you ensure you are building character, a deepening identity organized around genuine purpose, and not merely competence, a behavioral repertoire that performs courage without being courageous. The distinction is invisible to everyone else. It is the only one that matters. Philosopher's Spotlight, Aristotle on Habituation. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, tutored Alexander the Great before founding the Lyceum in Athens. His deepest moral insight is that character ethos comes from habit ethos. Two Greek words, separated by a single vowel, carrying the whole weight of his moral psychology. In Nicomachean Ethics Book 2, Aristotle argues that virtues are not innate gifts. We acquire them by doing virtuous acts repeatedly until right action and right feeling becomes second nature, literally our nature, genuinely our own. The courageous person is not someone who never fears, but someone who has practiced facing fear until appropriate feeling and appropriate action move together, naturally and stably. Character, on this account, is not who you were born as. It is who you have made yourself. Courage challenge: choose one courageous behavior to practice every day for the next 14 days. Name it precisely, not be braver, but say the thing I've been not saying in Monday meetings. Track it in your courage log. At the end of 14 days, ask yourself, has this become more natural? Has it become more mine? What is the opposite of courage? Part 1, the question explored. Picture two soldiers at the edge of a trench somewhere in northern France, the year 1916. The signal to advance has just been given. The man on the left vaults over the parapet and sprints forward without breaking stride, no pause, no apparent hesitation, no visible calculation of the distance to the enemy line or the rate of fire coming at him from 3 directions. He is the first man over, and for a moment the men behind him are awed. The man on the right does not move. He grips the wooden edge of the trench. His boots are planted. His body understands what his mind will not quite form into a sentence, that to go forward is to walk into something that will very likely kill him, and every nerve he has is voting against it. Neither of these men is courageous. That is a hard sentence. It is meant to be. If courage were simply a matter of whether you moved forward or stayed still, the first soldier would be the exemplary case and the second a cautionary tale. But the problem with that reading, the one that most popular accounts of courage quietly endorse, is that it tells us nothing useful. It gives us action as a proxy for virtue, and action without the right relationship to fear, to purpose, and to judgment is not virtue. It is something else. The question before us is, what is that something else? And is there only one opposite of courage, or are there two? The ancient Greeks saw two. They had a word for what paralyzed the second soldier, deilia, cowardice, and a word for what drove the first one over the parapet without calculation, phrasitas, rashness. Both were recognized as failures. Both were classified as the vices that stood on either side of the virtue they were unable to be. The insight is Aristotle's, and it is so precisely drawn that it has required almost no revision in 2.5 millennia. In Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, Aristotle sets out his doctrine of the mean as applied to courage. Aristotle, 350 BCE, 3.7. Courage, he argues, is the virtue of the person who responds to danger with the precise degree of fear and confidence that the situation actually warrants, not more, not less. On one side of this equilibrium lies cowardice, the failure of deficiency, in which the person feels and acts on more fear than the circumstances justify. On the other side lies rashness, the failure of excess, in which the person feels and acts on less fear than the circumstances justify, charging where he should pause, mistaking the absence of a response for the presence of a virtue. The reckless man is not brave. He simply does not register real danger. Aristotle is careful here in a way that matters enormously. The soldier who vaults the parapet because he has calculated the odds, weighed the purpose of the advance, accepted the genuine risk, and gone forward anyway, that man is courageous. The soldier who vaults the parapet because his brain is not generating the appropriate fear signal, because the danger does not land as danger, is merely useful to the army. He is not exhibiting virtue. He is exhibiting a defect that happens, in this particular context, to produce desirable behavior. Change the context and the same defect will produce catastrophe. The coward, by contrast, feels more fear than the situation warrants. Aristotle does not say the coward feels no genuine fear, the danger is real, but that the fear the coward feels is disproportionate, and that he acts on it by fleeing or freezing when the situation called for action. The coward is not deficient in feeling, he is deficient in the calibration of feeling to reality, and in the will to override feeling when purpose demands it. This three-point spectrum, cowardice, courage, rashness, is Aristotle's deepest contribution to the analysis of courage, and it immediately complicates the popular story. In that popular story, the brave person is the one who does the thing, and the coward is the one who doesn't. Aristotle insists that doing the thing is not sufficient. Doing the thing without appropriate fear is not courage, it is recklessness. The virtue lies not in the action alone, but in the action combined with the right relationship to the genuine risk. Plato, in the Republic, Book 4, adds a dimension that Aristotle's framework does not fully capture. For Plato, cowardice is not primarily an emotional failure, it is an epistemic one. Plato, 380 BCE, 4.429 of 430. The coward fails to preserve the correct belief about what is truly terrible. Under the pressure of fear, he revises his assessment of the situation. What seemed worth risking yesterday seems not worth it now, because the fear is louder than the judgment. Cowardice, on this reading, is a failure of epistemic steadiness, the inability to maintain a clear-eyed view of what the situation actually demands when that view is being contested by everything your body is telling you. This is why Plato locates courage in the spirited part of the soul that holds fast, keeping the mind's judgments intact when sensation is screaming for retreat. The coward who stood in the trench did not necessarily lack the desire to advance. He may have wanted to advance desperately. What he lacked was the ability to keep believing, truly and operatively believing, in the sense that governs action, that the advance was worth the fear. The fear rewrote his assessment of the situation, and the rewritten assessment won. Cicero, writing in the 1st century BCE, extends the concept into a domain that neither Plato nor Aristotle explored with full seriousness, the civic and political sphere. In De Officiis, Book I, Cicero argues that one of the most consequential forms of cowardice is not the physical failure of the soldier but the moral failure of the statesman who stays silent when justice demands speech. Cicero, 44 BCE, I.23. The politician who sees an injustice being done and says nothing, not because he has judged silence to be strategically wise, but because speaking would cost him something, is exhibiting the cowardice of the comfortable. The injustice is the threat. The required response is speech. The failure to speak is flight, internal flight, invisible flight, but flight nonetheless. Cicero's insight is worth dwelling on because it changes the typical shape of the question. We tend to think of cowardice as what happens under immediate physical danger: the frozen soldier, the retreating general, the firefighter who cannot make himself enter the building. But Cicero is pointing at something far more common, far more socially tolerated, and arguably more corrosive. The silence of those who know. The acquiescence of those who see. The careful, comfortable omissions of people who have everything to lose and are not willing to risk it for the truth. This is cowardice as much as any frozen soldier, and it is far more frequently the form it takes in most people's actual lives. What emerges from these three accounts, Aristotle's structural analysis, Plato's epistemic account, and Cicero's civic extension, is a picture of courage not as a single capacity but as a dynamic equilibrium. Courage is not a fixed point, it is a balance maintained under pressure, and the pressure is always working in two directions at once. Too much fear uncorrected tips the balance toward cowardice. Too little fear, or fear bypassed by temperament, conditioning, or ideology, tips it toward recklessness. Both are instabilities. The coward is being pushed by the current of his fear toward the exit. The reckless man is being pushed by the current of his insensibility toward a wall he cannot see. Courage is the swimmer who recognizes both currents and holds the line between them. This equilibrium is always personal and contextual. The threshold of appropriate fear differs for different people in different situations. What is reckless in a civilian may be appropriate in a soldier. What is courageous in a young person with few obligations may be reckless in a parent of 4. Aristotle knew this, which is why he insisted that courage cannot be reduced to a rule. It requires phronesis, practical wisdom, to perceive the right calibration in each situation, and that wisdom is developed only through experience, attention, and honest self-appraisal over time. The coward is the man who despairs because he fears things he ought not to fear, or fears them more than he ought. The rash man errs in excess on the other side, he fears nothing, or fears less than he ought. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, 3.7, Part 2, Modern Lens. The 20th century did something the ancients could not have anticipated. It put cowardice under a microscope and found that it was not always, or even usually, a moral choice. It was sometimes a learned response, a pattern burned into the nervous system by repeated experiences of helplessness that had taught a person, with ruthless empirical efficiency, that their effort did not matter. Martin Seligman's foundational experiments in the 1960s and 1970s, which he would eventually term learned helplessness, began with an observation that troubled him deeply. Seligman, 1972, page 407. Animals and later, humans, who were exposed repeatedly to uncontrollable adverse events did not simply become sad. They became passive. They stopped trying, even when trying would have worked. The nervous system had drawn a conclusion from the data: effort is futile, resistance is pointless, the situation will do what it will do regardless of what you do in response. That conclusion was not a moral failing. It was, in a grim way, a rational inference from the available evidence. Seligman's work matters for our question because it separates two things that popular moral discourse tends to fuse: cowardice as a moral failure and passivity as a learned state. The person who has been conditioned by years of organizational punishment, by a childhood that systematically taught them that their voice produced no effect, by a system that consistently rewarded silence and crushed dissent, that person's passivity is not the same as the cowardice Aristotle was describing. It may look identical from the outside. It does not have the same origin, and it does not respond to the same intervention. To call it a moral failing when it is a trained response is both inaccurate and unkind. This complicates blame without dissolving responsibility. Knowing that cowardice can be learned does not mean that nothing can be done about it. What it means is that the path back from it is less a matter of moral resolve and more a matter of carefully accumulated experience of agency, of discovering, incrementally and in low-stakes situations first, that effort does in fact produce results, that the voice does in fact land, that the action does in fact matter. Courage, on this account, has to be rebuilt the same way it was dismantled, one experience at a time. Brené Brown's contribution to this question arrives from a different direction, but its structure is closely related. In Dare to Lead, Brown, 2018, page 11, she argues that the opposite of courage is not, or not primarily, fear. It is armor. The armor we construct around ourselves to avoid the experience of vulnerability, the cynicism that inoculates against disappointment, the perfectionism that delays exposure indefinitely, the compulsive busyness that fills the silence where honest self-examination might otherwise occur, the people-pleasing that substitutes approval-seeking for authentic action. These are not absences of courage. They are active, effortful constructions, elaborate behavioral systems built to ensure that nothing genuinely threatening gets through. Brown calls this emotional cowardice masquerading as strength. It is a precise formulation. The cynic appears tough. The perfectionist appears exacting. The perpetually busy person appears driven. From the outside, none of these look like cowardice. From the inside, and Brown's research is largely built on what people report from the inside, they are exactly cowardice, the systematic avoidance of the genuine risk that vulnerability entails. They are the interior equivalent of the soldier who stays in the trench, except that in this case the trench is very comfortable, professionally defensible, and socially rewarded. Ryan Holiday, drawing directly on the Stoic tradition, cuts through a confusion that Brown also identifies but frames differently. Holiday, 2021, page 3. Fear, Holiday insists, is not the opposite of courage. Fear is the raw material courage works with. The person who acts from cowardice and the person who acts from courage are both afraid. Fear is the constant, the variable is what each person does with it. The coward surrenders to fear, allowing it to determine the action. The courageous person acknowledges fear, moves alongside it, and acts from something larger. To speak of overcoming fear as the goal is to misidentify the project. The goal is not to eliminate fear but to refuse to let fear be the deciding factor. This is the Stoic correction to the recklessness trap, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Much of what passes for courage in organizational culture is, in Aristotle's terms, rashness. The leader who makes bold proclamations without adequate analysis, the executive who launches initiatives without understanding their second-order effects, the entrepreneur who mistakes financial recklessness for visionary confidence, these are the modern versions of the soldier who vaults the parapet without calculating the range. The boldness is real. The courage is not. Organizations have built catastrophes around leaders who confused bravado with virtue, the confidence that skipped the fear signal, the decisiveness that bypassed the analysis, the bias for action that was really a flight from the discomfort of uncertainty. Here is where the ancient and modern accounts most sharply converge. both cowardice and recklessness undermine not just the individual but the community around them. The coward leaves things undone that needed doing, the reckless leader does things that needed not doing, and does them at everyone else's expense. Both failures are, in the end, failures of relationship, failures of the obligation that a person with capacity and position has to the people who depend on them. When institutions systematically punish courageous dissent and reward silence, they manufacture cowardice at scale. What was one person's trained helplessness becomes a culture's defining characteristic. Where the accounts diverge most productively is in the moral dimension. Aristotle understood cowardice as a character failing cultivated through repeated wrong choices. Modern psychology, from Seligman forward, has shown that it is also sometimes a trained response, environmentally induced, which can be environmentally undone. The blame shifts, the responsibility does not. You may not have chosen to learn cowardice. You can still choose to unlearn it. Reflection prompt: where in your life are you armoring up instead of showing up, and what would it cost you to lower the armor, just once, this week? Part 3, Courage in Action. The 3-point spectrum: cowardice, courage, rashness is not only an intellectual map. It is a diagnostic tool. Used honestly, it tells you something precise about the shape of your last decision, and about the pattern that may be forming across many decisions. Used regularly, it becomes the mechanism by which Aristotle's phronesis develops, not through abstract study but through the habit of applying clear analysis to your actual life. Practice 1: Audit your armor. Sit down with a blank page and list the defensive behaviors you reach for when you are afraid. The deflection into humor when a conversation turns serious. The overwhelming of people with data when a simple, exposed statement would have served better. The perfecting instead of publishing, the project that is never quite ready, the email that goes through 12 drafts, the conversation you have been rehearsing for 6 months. The strategic silence in the meeting where you knew exactly what needed to be said. Name each one. Armor is not weakness, it was protection once. Every defensive behavior you have developed made sense in some context where the threat was real and the armor was necessary. But armor becomes cowardice when the threat has passed and the armor stays, when you are still defending yourself against a danger that no longer exists, in a room full of people who are not actually your enemies. Name the armor. You cannot take it off until you can see it. Practice 2: Run the spectrum test on your last 3 big decisions. Take 3 decisions you have made in the past 6 months, decisions about what to say, what to do, what to begin, what to end. For each one, ask yourself 2 questions in sequence. Was I cowardly? Did I avoid what genuinely needed doing because it frightened me? Or was I reckless? Did I act without adequate thought, mistaking momentum or adrenaline for courage? Or did I hold the mean, feeling the appropriate fear and acting from a genuine purpose in spite of it? Most people, examining their decisions with real candor, will find that they oscillate: cowardly in some domains, reckless in others, occasionally, in the best moments, genuinely calibrated. This is not self-flagellation. This is Aristotle's phronesis in practice, learning to see yourself clearly enough to calibrate the next decision better than the last one. Practice 3: Find one place you have been organizationally silent. There is a dysfunctional dynamic you have named privately and never publicly. A truth that everyone in the room knows and no one says. A pattern that has been visible for months and that no one with the standing to address it has addressed, because addressing it would cost something. Cicero's fortitudo, the courage that belongs in the civic and organizational sphere, begins here. Not with grand public stands, but with the carefully chosen, clearly stated observation made in the right room to the right people at the right moment. One sentence, said precisely, can do more than 100 silent agreements. You do not need to say everything. You need to say the one thing that is yours to say. Find it. Prepare the sentence. Say it once, in the right room, this week. Philosopher Spotlight: Aristotle on the mean. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, spent 20 years in Plato's academy before founding the Lyceum and developing a moral philosophy centered on character. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 3, he argued that every virtue sits between 2 vices, one of excess, one of deficiency, and courage is the clearest case. Cowardice is the deficiency, too much fear, too little action. Rashness is the excess, too little fear, too much undirected action. Courage is the dynamic calibration between them, achievable not by rule or formula but only through phronesis, practical wisdom built from honest experience and reflection over time. Courage challenge: identify one area where you have been silent when the situation called for speech. This week, say the thing once, clearly, in the right room. Prepare the sentence in advance. Write it down the night before. Say it. Can courage be learned? Part 1. The question explored the boy who would become Rome's greatest philosopher-emperor was not a promising candidate for courage. The tutors Marcus Aurelius hired in later life remembered him from childhood as cautious and bookish, a serious, flinching sort of child who preferred the company of his manuscripts to the roar of the crowd or the clatter of the training yard. There is no account of the young Marcus throwing himself into danger, no early story of the defiant stand that marks the born leader. He was, by every record we have, a studious, cautious, slightly anxious boy. He became emperor of Rome at 39, and spent 13 of the next 19 years campaigning on the frozen Danube frontier, commanding armies against the Germanic tribes in conditions that would have broken a man of softer character. Not once. Not twice. 13 years of grinding, unglamorous, exhausting warfare on behalf of an empire he had not sought and a role he had not wanted. Every morning of that campaign, before the day's business began, he wrote in his private journal, the notebook we now call the Meditations, working through arguments with himself, rehearsing the Stoic principles that would carry him through the hours ahead. Marcus Aurelius was not born courageous. He was, by his own account and by the accounts of those who knew him, trained into it. The Meditations are not the reflections of a naturally brave man. They are the working notes of a man who has decided what he intends to be and is constructing himself, daily, toward that intention. This is the question at the heart of the chapter: is courage something you either have or don't, a quality of soul that arrives with you, distributed at birth like height or musical aptitude, or is it something you build? The stakes of the answer are considerable. If courage is innate, then those who lack it are simply unlucky, and there is nothing to be done. If courage is built, then the conversation changes entirely. It becomes a question of method, of practice, of what Aristotle called habituation. Aristotle, working in Athens 3 centuries before Marcus was born, had already given us the framework. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, 350 BCE, 2.1, he made a claim that sounds simple but cuts deep: we become just by doing just acts, courageous by doing courageous acts. Virtues, on Aristotle's account, are not innate faculties that some people have and others lack. They are stable dispositions, reliable patterns of feeling, perception, and action that are built up through repeated right action. The technical word Aristotle uses is hexis, a settled state of character, a way of being that has become second nature. The philosophical depth of Aristotle's observation is embedded in the etymology he draws out. The Greek word for character, ethos, derives from ethos, habit. Character, properly understood, is not what you were given at birth. It is what you have done, repeatedly, across time. Courage is not a trait, it is a history of courageous acts that has solidified into a reliable way of meeting the world. This raises an obvious objection. If I simply act as if I were brave while feeling, beneath the performance, the full force of my fear, am I not just pretending? And what good is a pretense? Aristotle's answer is patient and precise. Acting as if brave is not the same as being brave, he would grant that immediately. But his insight, the one that distinguishes his position from any naive self-help formula, is that the performance consistently enough maintained becomes the disposition. This is not fake it till you make it. It is the mechanism by which all virtues are formed. The child learning a musical instrument does not play beautifully at first. She plays badly, then less badly, then adequately, then well, until at last she plays without thinking, until the music flows from a disposition rather than from effort. The same logic governs courage. The first acts of courage are effortful, conscious, performed against a strong internal resistance. The later ones are less so. Eventually, the disposition has formed. The Stoics, who came after Aristotle and drew heavily on this tradition, were systematically practical about the question of how courage is built. They were not content with the philosophical observation that habits form character, they wanted a method, a daily practice, a regimen. Marcus Aurelius's morning pages are the most intimate record we have of that practice. At the opening of Book 2 of the Meditations, Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 CE, 2.1, he writes, "Begin the morning by saying to yourself, I shall meet today inquisitive, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, uncharitable men. All these things happen to them by reason of their ignorance of what is good and evil." The passage goes on and Marcus rehearses the insults and disappointments the day will bring, naming them in advance, deciding in advance how he will meet them. This is not pessimism. It is inoculation. By walking through the day's probable difficulties before they arrive, Marcus drains from them the power of surprise. The mind that has encountered a difficulty in imagination is less ambushed by it in reality. The Stoic practice behind this has a name, premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. Seneca describes it in the letters to Lucilius Seneca, 65 CE, letter 91. Imagine the worst that could happen, not to generate anxiety, but to neutralize it. The unexamined fear rules you through its vagueness. The examined fear can be faced directly, weighed, and placed in right proportion. Seneca's counsel is not catastrophizing, it is the opposite of catastrophizing. It is the deliberate, calm inspection of what you are afraid of, conducted in the controlled conditions of morning quiet, so that when the feared thing appears in the uncontrolled conditions of the actual day, it finds you already prepared. Plato, who preceded both Aristotle and the Stoics, raised the problem in its sharpest form. In the Protagoras, Plato, 380 BCE, Socrates and the great sophist argue over whether virtue can be taught. Protagoras takes the affirmative. Of course, virtue is transmitted, he says, by parents, teachers, laws, and culture. It is what education is for, and every functioning society is organized around the project of transmitting it. Socrates unsettles the answer with characteristic precision. If virtue could be reliably taught, why do brave fathers so often have cowardly sons? Themistocles was a great general, why didn't he pass that quality to his children? The best men seem unable to transmit their excellence through deliberate instruction, which suggests that virtue is not quite like skill, not something that flows cleanly from teacher to student through declared intention. But the puzzle does not end there, and Plato knows it. Some things are learned without being directly taught. Language is learned by immersion, not by grammar lessons. Character is absorbed from a household, a community, a culture. The failure of brave fathers to reliably produce brave sons does not prove that courage cannot be learned, it may simply prove that courage is not transmittable by instruction. There is a difference between learning and being taught. The formation of courage is closer to the first than the second. The resolution Aristotle offers stands: yes, courage is learnable, but not primarily through information. You cannot read your way to courage, any more than you can read your way to strength. It is learned the way all habits are learned, through repetition, in the presence of fear, with a purpose clear enough and worthy enough to return to, day after day, until the returning becomes its own kind of character. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations Part 2, Modern lends the question that Aristotle answered in terms of hexis and ethos, modern researchers have answered in terms of grit scales and neural architecture and arrived, with striking consistency, in the same place. Angela Duckworth's research program, summarized in Grit, Duckworth, 2016, page 269, began with a puzzle similar to Plato's: why do some people persist and others quit, and does the difference track anything measurable? Working with cadets at West Point, students at the National Spelling Bee, and teachers in some of America's most difficult schools, Duckworth found that the predictor of long-run success was not talent, not intelligence, not even raw willpower. It was what she named grit, passion and perseverance in pursuit of long-term goals, sustained over years rather than hours. Her key finding for our purposes is not just that grit matters, but that it is developable. At KIPP schools, where students from high-risk backgrounds consistently outperform their demographic predictions, Duckworth documented programs in which courageous persistence, the willingness to stay with difficulty, was explicitly taught, practiced, and cultivated as a skill. Duckworth, 2016, page 166. Grit, she concluded, is not a fixed character trait. It is a capacity that grows through exercise, which is Aristotle's habituation model dressed in the language of positive psychology. The neuroscience of fear confirms this from a different angle. Joseph Ledoux, in Anxious, Ledoux, 2015, page 11, maps the competing neural systems at work when we encounter something frightening. The amygdala processes threat signals faster than conscious thought, faster than deliberation, faster than reason. Its job is to mobilize the body for survival, and it performs the job without consulting you. When you feel your heart rate spike before a difficult conversation, that is the amygdala doing its work, registering a social threat with the same ancient urgency it would register a predator. But the amygdala does not have the last word. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of deliberate reasoning, context sensitivity, and long-term thinking, can override the amygdala's alarm signal. It does not suppress the signal, it interprets it, contextualizes it, and modulates the behavioral response. And this is the neuroscientific foundation of learned courage. The prefrontal cortex pathway is strengthened by repeated exposure. Every time you encounter a feared situation and act anyway, every time you feel the amygdala's alarm and choose approach over avoidance, you are reinforcing the neural architecture of courage. You are, in the literal biological sense, building it. This is what exposure therapy makes systematic. In clinical practice, gradual exposure to feared situations, beginning with the mildly threatening and increasing incrementally toward the genuinely feared, progressively recalibrates the fear response. The amygdala does not stop firing, but the prefrontal cortex learns, through accumulated experience, that engagement with the feared thing does not result in catastrophe. The stimulus loses its power not because it has been suppressed, but because the brain has updated its model of what that stimulus actually means. This is Aristotle's habituation in the language of neuroscience, repeated right action, building a stable disposition, through the mechanism of neural pathway strengthening. Military training programs have applied this insight deliberately for decades. U.S. Army stress inoculation programs, which expose soldiers in training to realistic simulations of combat stress before they encounter actual combat, operate on exactly this principle. Grossman, 1995, page 30. The experience of hardship in controlled conditions builds genuine resilience for hardship in uncontrolled ones. Soldiers who have been deliberately stressed, who have performed under simulated chaos, are measurably better at performing under actual chaos. The inoculation works not by making the real thing feel less dangerous, but by making the performer's response to danger more reliable. The civilian applications are direct: leaders who practice difficult conversations before they happen, executives who rehearse their responses to crisis scenarios. Professionals who deliberately seek out the uncomfortable before it becomes urgent, all are engaged in a version of the same training. What emerges, when we set Aristotle beside Duckworth, beside Ledoux, beside the Army's training manuals, is a remarkable convergence. Ancient and modern accounts agree that courage is built, not given. Where they differ is in the level of description. Aristotle describes the moral process, the way virtuous action solidifies into character through repeated choice. Neuroscience describes the biological process, the way the prefrontal cortex pathway is strengthened through repeated exposure. They are not competing accounts. They are the same phenomenon described from different vantage points, 2 millennia and 2 disciplines apart. The mechanism is practice. The product is character. Reflection prompt: think of one courageous capacity you have already built, something that frightened you 5 years ago that barely registers now. How did that happen? What does it teach you about what's possible in the next 5 years? Part 3, Courage in Action. The philosophical case is settled. Courage is learnable. The question shifts to method. Not what courage is, but how you build it, not the theory of habituation, but the practice of it, in the particular conditions of your particular life. What follows are 3 practices drawn directly from the ancient and modern sources. They are not inspirational suggestions. They are techniques with identified mechanisms, confirmed by both philosophical tradition and contemporary research. Practice 1, Stoic Premeditatio Malorum. Morning courage preparation. Each morning, before the day begins, take 2 minutes. Think through what you will face today that might require courage: the hard conversation you have been circling, the exposing presentation, the decision no one wants to make and everyone is waiting for you to make. Name each one specifically. Then decide in advance how you will respond. Not the outcome. You cannot control the outcome. The response: what you will do, what you will say, how you will carry yourself when the moment arrives. This is what Marcus Aurelius was doing in those pre-dawn journal entries on the Danube frontier. The Stoics understood what Ledoux's neuroscience has since confirmed: the mind that has rehearsed difficulty is less ambushed by it and more capable of acting through it. 2 minutes in the quiet of morning is worth an hour of reactive improvisation under pressure. Practice 2: Voluntary discomfort, one small uncomfortable act daily. This is the exposure therapy principle applied without a clinical setting. Choose one thing each day that makes you mildly uncomfortable and do it anyway. Not dramatically, the point is not drama but calibration. The cold shower. The email you have been postponing for 3 days. The opinion you have been holding private in meetings where your view is needed. The call you have been routing to voicemail. The purpose is not the act itself. Most of these acts are individually trivial. The purpose is the neural pathway. Every time you move toward discomfort rather than away from it, you train the prefrontal cortex to treat approach as the default response. The training effect is cumulative and directional. Small acts of voluntary discomfort, practiced daily, shift the baseline of what your nervous system registers as threatening. This is Aristotle's repeated right action translated into a practice you can sustain without a philosophy degree. Practice 3: Stress inoculation for leaders. Role-play the hard conversation. Before any high-stakes interaction, a difficult performance review, a confrontation with a peer who has undermined you, a presentation to a skeptical board, practice it first. Say the words out loud, not in your head, but in the air of an actual room. Ask someone you trust to play the difficult role. Let them push back. Let the conversation get uncomfortable in rehearsal, or it costs nothing. The stumble in rehearsal is free, the stumble in the actual conversation carries weight. Preparation of this kind is not a confession of weakness. It is the deliberate manufacturing of courage before you need it. Stress inoculation applied to civilian life. Leaders who do this consistently report not that the real conversation becomes easy, but that they enter it having already survived a version of it. That prior survival changes what is available to them in the moment. Philosopher Spotlight. Marcus Aurelius, 121–180 CE, last of Rome's 5 good emperors, is history's most compelling example of trained rather than innate courage. His tutors remembered him as cautious and bookish, not naturally bold. Through sustained Stoic practice, he became a man who commanded armies on the frozen Danube frontier for 13 years, governing an empire through plague and war. The Meditations, never intended for publication, are his private training journal, daily rehearsals of Stoic principle designed to steel him for each day. They are the working notes of a man constructing his character, one morning at a time. Courage Challenge. Begin a 7-day discomfort log. Each day, write down one thing that made you uncomfortable and whether you moved toward it or away from it. At the end of 7 days, look at the pattern. That pattern is your current character. The log is the first step toward changing it. When is courage foolish? Part 1. The question explored on the morning of October 25, 1854, 673 British cavalrymen lined up in a valley near Balaclava, in the Crimea, with Russian artillery positioned on 3 sides of them. They had received an order garbled in transmission, misread by the officer who relayed it, issued by a general who could not see the terrain from where he stood. The order as understood told them to charge the Russian guns at the end of the valley. They did not question it. They dressed their lines, raised their sabers, and rode forward. Lord Cardigan, who led the charge, survived. A third of his men did not. The 6-minute assault would later be called one of the great military disasters of the 19th century. Tennyson, writing within weeks of the event, transformed it into a monument of heroism. There's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. Military historians have been less romantic. The terrain was wrong, the intelligence was wrong, the order was wrong, and the men who carried it out paid with their lives for failures that belonged to their commanders. The question the charge of the Light Brigade forces us to ask is not whether those cavalrymen were brave. They were, unambiguously. The question is whether bravery exercised in those conditions, without accurate knowledge of the situation, without a realistic assessment of the odds, without a purpose proportionate to the cost, is courage at all, or whether it is something else, something that wears courage's uniform while lacking its substance. The soldiers in that valley were not cowards. But were they wise? And if they were not wise, were they truly courageous? Aristotle had a word for what they were. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, 350 BC, 3.7, he was careful to distinguish genuine courage from its closest counterfeit, rashness. The rash man, on Aristotle's account, is not a courageous man who happens to have made a bad calculation. He is a different kind of person altogether. He does not register danger accurately. He either fails to perceive the real risk in a situation, or he perceives it and charges forward for reasons that have more to do with pride, or the appearance of bravery, or the impossibility of being seen to hesitate, than with any genuine assessment of whether the action is right. Rashness is the excess where cowardice is the deficiency. Courage is the mean, and the mean is not a point you arrive at by accident. It requires a faculty. That faculty is phronesis, practical wisdom. Aristotle is explicit in Nicomachean Ethics Book 6 that practical wisdom is not merely one virtue among others. It is the governing virtue, the capacity that makes the other virtues coherent. Without phronesis, courage does not know where to aim itself. A man may have tremendous reserves of fortitude and willingness to act in the face of fear. Without phronesis, he has no reliable way to distinguish the situations that call for that fortitude from the situations that call for a different response, for patience, for restraint, for retreat. Phronesis is the faculty that reads situations accurately. It perceives what is actually at stake, what the options actually are, and what action is actually proportionate to what is required. Courage without phronesis is powerful but blind. It may do tremendous things. It is just as likely to do them in the wrong direction. Plato's dialogue Laches, Plato, 399 BCE, gives us a partial anticipation of this problem. The general Nicias, one of the two interlocutors who argues with Socrates, proposes a definition of courage that points toward it. Courage, Nicias says, is knowledge of the fearful and the hopeful, knowledge of what is genuinely to be feared and what is genuinely to be hoped for. The courageous person is not the one who merely endures or merely charges. He is the one who sees the situation clearly enough to know what actually warrants fear and what actually warrants hope. Courage, on this account, is a form of accurate perception. It is the virtue of the person who is not deceived about what is in front of him. Socrates dismantles this definition. He shows that if courage is simply knowledge of fearful and hopeful things, it collapses into the whole of wisdom and loses its distinctiveness. But Nicias was pointing at something real, even if his formulation was imprecise. The cavalrymen at Balaclava lacked what Nicias was gesturing at. They did not know what was genuinely fearful, or rather, they knew that death by Russian cannon was fearful, but they rode forward anyway, not because they had judged the action proportionate and noble, but because the order had come and the order was not theirs to question. "There's not to reason why" is Tennyson's praise. It is also, if we read it from the right angle, a description of the problem. Thomas Aquinas, working in the 13th century, added a distinction that sharpens this further. In the Summa Theologica, Aquinas, 1274, III 124 Quetzales, he distinguishes the martyr who accepts death for a genuine good at truth, faith, justice, from the person who throws away their life carelessly or for a cause that does not merit the sacrifice. What separates them is not merely the fact of dying, nor even the presence or absence of fear. It is the purpose. The martyr's death is oriented towards something genuinely noble. It is not waste, it is witness. The person who expends their life for an inadequate cause, or through a failure of judgment, is not a martyr. They are simply careless with the life they were given. Courage without a worthy purpose is not courage. It is expenditure without return. Epictetus saw a different failure mode, one that has a particularly modern flavor. In the Discourses, Epictetus, 108 CE, I.2, he identifies the person who mistakes stubbornness for courage, who refuses to adapt not from principle but from pride, who holds to a position not because he has examined it and found it true but because changing it would mean admitting he was wrong, and admission feels like weakness. This is ego wearing courage's clothes. It has the outward appearance of resolution. It has the inward reality of rigidity. And it is, Epictetus suggests, not a virtue but a trap, a failure of the self-knowledge that Stoic practice was designed to cultivate. The Stoic ideal was not the man who never wavered. It was the man who was clear-eyed enough to know when he was wavering from genuine conviction and when he was merely nursing pride. That distinction, between holding the line and clutching the line, is one that requires constant interrogation of one's own motives. Without it, what looks like principled persistence is often nothing more than the inability to be wrong in front of other people. What emerges from all of this is a composite answer, refined across several centuries of argument. Courage is foolish, that is, it ceases to be genuine courage and becomes something lesser, in four identifiable ways. First, when it is divorced from phronesis, when the courageous actor has not accurately assessed the situation, the odds, or the available options, and acts from assumption or emotion rather than sound judgment. Second, when it lacks a worthy purpose, when the action is not oriented toward something genuinely noble, but toward appearance, pride, or the refusal to be seen hesitating. Third, when it is disproportionate, when the risk taken vastly exceeds what the situation actually requires, and a more measured action would have served as well or better. Fourth, and this is the insight that the modern discussion will sharpen, when the courageous actor does not bear the consequences of their own risk, and someone else pays the price for their boldness. This last condition is implicit in the Balaclava story. Lord Cardigan survived. His men did not. The general who issued the misunderstood order watched from a hilltop. The courage, if we insist on calling it that, was performed by those who had no choice in the matter, in the service of a plan they had no part in making, at a cost borne entirely by them. Courage that is paid for by someone other than the person who claims it is not a virtue. It is a transfer. It is impossible to be good in the full sense without practical wisdom, or practically wise without moral virtue. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, 6.13, Part 2, Modern lens. The Aristotelian framework holds up well across 23 centuries, but it gains new texture when we run it against the problems of the present. The modern world has developed its own forms of foolish courage, its own ways of dressing recklessness in the language of boldness, of externalizing risk while claiming the credit for bravery. Nassim Taleb, in Skin in the Game, Taleb, 2018, and Anti-Fragile, Taleb, 2012, page 5, offers the sharpest contemporary formulation of the Aquinas point. Courage is credible and genuinely non-foolish only when the courageous actor bears the consequences of their own risk. Taleb calls the opposite arrangement by a name drawn from a real example, Bob Rubin risk transfer. The pattern is familiar in boardrooms and in government. The decision-maker takes the bold bet, claims the upside if it works, and transfers the downside to shareholders, employees, taxpayers, or whoever happens to be standing downstream when the bet fails. They call this leadership. Taleb calls it asymmetric risk-taking, and he is clear that it is not courage but a kind of legalized cowardice, the willingness to be seen as bold at someone else's expense. This is not a marginal case. It is the organizational norm in many institutions. The executive who announces a courageous restructuring, meaning significant layoffs, while their own compensation is insulated by contract. The strategist who recommends the aggressive market move and is promoted when it works, then moves to a different firm before the consequences of the failure materialize. The policy official who advocates for the bold initiative and leaves before the implementation problems become visible. In each case, the person claiming the virtue of boldness has arranged things so that they need not actually pay for it. Taleb's test, who bears the consequences, is a clean, practical instrument for distinguishing genuine courage from its institutional counterfeit. Ryan Holiday, in Courage is Calling, Holiday, 2021, draws a different but related distinction. He separates courage that serves a genuine good from ego-driven bravado that happens to look courageous from the outside. Bravado, Holiday argues, answers only one question: am I being brave? And it answers that question with great satisfaction. Genuine courage answers three harder ones: what is this for? Who does this serve? Am I the right person to be doing this? The cavalryman who charges because the order came answers none of them. The executive who takes the dramatic action because it creates an atmosphere of decisive leadership answers the first with a gesture and ignores the others entirely. Holiday's three questions are not comfortable ones. They require the person claiming courage to examine their own motives with a candor that most people would rather avoid. It is far easier to feel the force of a situation, to feel the fear and act through it, and then to name what you did as courage, than to pause beforehand and ask whether the action was actually in service of something beyond yourself. Ego-driven bravado is intoxicating precisely because it feels identical to genuine courage from the inside. The adrenaline is the same. The sense of purpose is the same. Only the target differs. One is aimed at something genuinely worth the risk, the other is aimed, in the end, at the courageous actor's own image. The psychology literature adds a troubling dimension. Research on risk compensation, sometimes called the Peltzman effect or the helmet effect, shows that people who feel protected or empowered often become less careful, not more. The sense of bravery or security that comes from taking bold action can impair the very judgment the action depends on. There is a recursive danger. Here, the more convinced you are of your own courage, the more susceptible you may be to the overconfidence that turns courage into recklessness. This is not a small irony. It is a structural vulnerability in the psychology of the courageous actor, and it is one that the ancient authors did not fully anticipate but that modern behavioral research has documented with some precision. What does it take to guard against this? The classical answer and the modern answer converge on the same thing: genuine humility about the limits of your own knowledge and perception. Lord Cardigan did not know the terrain. He did not have reliable intelligence on the disposition of the Russian guns. He did not understand the misreading that had produced his orders. A man who knew what he did not know, who held his uncertainty accurately, would have paused before he led 600 men into an artillery crossfire. The Phronesis test is partly an epistemological test, not am I brave enough to do this? But do I actually know enough to do this well? Real courage requires knowing the limits of your knowledge. The general who has reliable intelligence, understands the terrain, and has a clear-eyed assessment of his troops' capabilities is in a position to be courageous. Lord Cardigan was not. He was in a position to perform courage, and the performance cost men their lives. The gap between those two things is exactly the gap that Phronesis is designed to close. Ancient and modern accounts converge here with unusual consistency. Courage divorced from accurate perception of the situation is Aristotle's rashness. Courage that transfers risk to others is Taleb's Bob Rubin. Courage that serves the actor's image rather than a genuine good is Holliday's bravado. Courage inflated by overconfidence into recklessness is the helmet effect. The names have changed. The failure mode is the same one Aristotle named in 350 BCE, the excess that exceeds the mean, the charge that did not need to happen, the boldness that bore no relationship to wisdom. Phronesis is not the enemy of courage. It is the thing that makes courage worth having. Reflection prompt: think of a time you called something courage that was really recklessness, a bold move made without sufficient information, or a risk you took that others paid for. What was the difference between that and genuine courage? What would the Phronesis test have revealed in advance? Part 3, Courage in Action. The distinction between courage and recklessness is not only a philosophical question. It is a practical one you face every time you are about to do something bold. The classical account gives you a set of tests. Use them. Practice 1, apply the Phronesis test before bold action. Before any significant act of courage, the confrontation, the public stand, the bold bet, the conversation you have been postponing, ask 3 questions in sequence, and answer them honestly rather than strategically. First, do you have accurate information about this situation, or are you acting on assumption, emotion, or data that is incomplete? If you cannot accurately describe the terrain, the risks, and the likely consequences, you are not in a position to be making a unilateral charge. Second, is the purpose genuinely noble? Is what you are protecting or advancing worth the risk you are about to take and ask others to absorb? Third, are you bearing the consequences of this risk yourself? Or are you proposing to be brave at someone else's expense, in someone else's career, someone else's money, someone else's stability? Courage that fails any of these 3 tests is not automatically ruled out, but it deserves a second look before you act. The test is not designed to prevent action. It is designed to prevent the wrong action at the wrong time for the wrong reasons, which is not courage but its shadow. Practice 2, build a devil's advocate practice. Before every significant bold move, genuinely argue against it, not to avoid it, but to test whether it can withstand honest pressure. Find the 3 strongest reasons not to do this. Steelman the opposing position, assume the best critics of your plan are right, and see what their case looks like when you take it seriously. If your courageous action survives that examination, if it holds up under the strongest available objection, you can proceed with real confidence that what you are doing has the substance of courage and not just its appearance. If it does not hold up, you have learned something cheaply. The scrutiny is always less expensive than the charge into the valley. A plan that cannot survive an honest internal challenge is not ready to survive the real one. Practice 3. Distinguish courage from ego. Ask yourself honestly, before you act, am I doing this because it is right or because I want to be seen as brave? Because I want to prove something to someone who doubted me? Because I committed publicly and now cannot back down without embarrassment? Ego courage and genuine courage are identical from the outside. Only you can see the inside. This question is not comfortable, and that discomfort is useful information. If the question makes you defensive, if you feel the urge to dismiss it quickly and get on with acting, that is a signal worth taking seriously. The cavalryman who charges because retreat feels like weakness is not making a military decision. He is making a psychological one, and calling it duty. The soldier who holds the line from clear-eyed conviction is doing something different, even if the two look identical from the observation post. Only you can see which one you are being. The question is the mirror. Philosopher Spotlight, Aristotle on Phronesis. Aristotle, 384–322 BCE, argued in Nicomachean Ethics Book 6 that phronesis, practical wisdom, is not one virtue among others but the capacity that governs all virtues. Without it, courage becomes recklessness, generosity becomes profligacy, confidence becomes arrogance. Phronesis is the ability to perceive a situation accurately, weigh competing goods, and act proportionally to what is required. It is not timidity or excessive caution. The phronimos, the person of practical wisdom, acts decisively, but only after seeing clearly. Courage paired with phronesis is the precise expression of a well-formed character. Courage without it is force without direction. Courage challenge: identify one bold decision you made in the past year that you called courage. Apply the phronesis test to it honestly, accurate information, noble purpose, bearing your own consequences. What does the test reveal? Use what you find to make the next bold decision better. What is quiet courage? Part 1, the question explored December 1, 1955. Rosa Parks is 42 years old, tired from a long day of work as a seamstress at a Montgomery department store, and seated in the first row of the colored section of a Montgomery City Lines bus. When the white section fills, the driver, James Blake, orders the passengers in her row to give up their seats. 3 people stand. Rosa Parks does not. She does not give a speech. She does not raise her fist. She does not deliver a manifesto, call out to the passengers around her, or make any gesture that the people watching from the sidewalk would have noticed as historic. She simply remains in her seat. When Blake asks her directly why she will not stand, her answer is 4 words: I don't think I should. What followed, the arrest, the boycott, the 381 days of 40,000 black residents refusing to ride the city's buses, the eventual Supreme Court ruling that segregated seating was unconstitutional, changed the country. But the act itself was almost silent. A woman in a seat. A word that was barely more than a breath. This is the paradox of quiet courage. It often looks, in the moment, like almost nothing. And yet it takes everything. We are drawn, as a culture, to the visible forms of courage. The soldier who charges the position. The executive who names the fraud in the board meeting. The whistleblower who holds a press conference. These images are powerful and they are real, but they are not the whole story, and they may not even be the most common one. They are the forms of courage that announce themselves, that arrive with narrative arc and social recognition. What they leave in their shadow is a vast, ordinary, largely unacknowledged practice of people doing difficult things quietly, without witnesses, without acclaim, without anyone naming what they are doing as courage at all. The question this chapter asks is simple and demanding in equal measure: what is that? Aristotle's primary account of courage in the Nicomachean Ethics is, by his own admission, a martial one. Aristotle, 350 BC, 3.6. The paradigm case is the soldier in battle, a man who faces the genuine prospect of death, feels the fear that such a prospect warrants, and acts in spite of it for a noble purpose. This is the central, clearest case, and Aristotle is not wrong to anchor the concept here. Death is the most unambiguous fearful thing. It is final, irreversible, and absolute, and the person who can hold his line when death is immediately available is exhibiting the virtue in its starkest form. But Aristotle does not stop there, and it is worth dwelling on what he does next. Almost reluctantly, he begins to admit other cases. The person who tells an unwelcome truth. The citizen who speaks against the popular view in the assembly. The philosopher who challenges the consensus of his teachers. These, Aristotle allows, also exhibit something that resembles courage, the same structure of a genuine fear met with purposeful action, even though the fear is not physical and the stakes are not death. His reluctance is legible in the text. He is a man of his military culture, and the warrior ideal pulls at him. But his philosophical honesty is stronger than his cultural preference, and he concedes that the virtue extends wherever genuine fear meets a worthy purpose, whatever form that fear takes. Cicero, writing in Rome in the year of his death, pressed this opening much further than Aristotle had been willing to go. In De Officiis, Book I, he drew a sharp and consequential distinction between military courage and what he called fortitudo civilis, civic courage. Cicero, 44 BC, I.20. The senator who speaks truth when the room is against him. The advocate who takes the case that no respectable lawyer will touch. The citizen who refuses to be swept along by what he knows to be unjust, even when the current of popular opinion is strong and the cost of resistance is sustained in public. Cicero argues, and this is the observation that stays with you, that civic courage is in many ways harder than military courage. In battle, the moment is acute and the outcome is swift. You act, and then you know. The courage required is terrible but brief. In civic life, the cost of courage is not a single terrible moment, it is a long, quiet, daily expenditure without drama, without the adrenaline that makes a soldier feel invincible, and without the certainty that the sacrifice will ever be recognized or rewarded. This is the first formal articulation in the Western tradition of something we now recognize immediately, the courage that does not announce itself. Cicero's fortitudo civilis is the courage of the person who goes into the same difficult meeting on Monday and on Tuesday and on Wednesday, who holds to a position that the institution around them is working to erode, who keeps saying the true thing in a culture that is rewarding the comfortable lie. It is not glamorous. It does not produce the moment that will be retold at a funeral or carved on a monument. It produces, at most, a private knowledge that you behaved well when behaving well was not required. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius in the letters that would become one of antiquity's most intimate philosophical documents, took this line of thought to its logical extreme. In Letter 8, he makes what is, on first reading, a surprising argument, that the courageous person may sometimes choose not to seek public glory at all. Seneca, 65 CE, Letter 8. Withdraw into yourself as much as you can, he writes. Not from cowardice, but from the recognition that quiet virtue is harder to maintain, and more genuine, than performance. The person who is good in public, before an audience that will reward goodness, is doing something praiseworthy. The person who is good in private, when no one is watching and no one will ever know, is doing something rarer. The audience is removed. The incentive structure is stripped away. What remains is bare character, in contact with its values, with nothing to prove and no one to impress. Seneca is not counseling withdrawal from the world. He is pointing at a specific form of courage, the courage not to perform. In a culture saturated with visibility, in Seneca's Rome no less than in our own era of documented lives and optimized reputations, there is a particular difficulty in acting rightly without staging the action, in being honest without broadcasting the honesty, in holding your values when there is no social reward for doing so. This is what Seneca means by the courage of the quiet life, and he regards it as genuinely difficult and genuinely admirable. I do this for the same reason as many others, I withdraw from people in order to be more useful to them. Seneca, Letters to Lucilius, Letter 8, Thomas Aquinas, a millennium and more after Seneca, added the distinction that may matter most for this chapter. In the Summa Theologica, Aquinas argued that fortitude has two acts, attack and endurance. Aquinas, 1274, IIIAE 123 Quetzales. Attack is what we most easily recognize as courage, advancing on a danger, engaging with a threat, doing the difficult thing in the difficult moment. But endurance, Aquinas writes, is the higher act. It is more difficult because it is not swift. Attack is a single act, charged with the adrenaline of the moment, finished when it is finished. Endurance is the same moment held open, indefinitely, without drama, without witnesses, without end in sight. Consider what endurance means in practice. The parent who tends a chronically ill child, not once in a heroic moment, but across years of daily exhaustion, without a defined conclusion and without the crisis clarity that makes acute situations feel purposeful. The nurse who returns to the same ward each morning, carrying the accumulated weight of what she saw the day before, and does the work with care. The employee who maintains his integrity inside an organization that is quietly organized around compromising it, day after day, in 100 small moments that no one else will ever see or count. Aquinas's insight is that these people are exhibiting the higher form of the virtue. Their courage is real, it is sustained, and it is almost entirely invisible. It does not produce a defining moment. It produces a life. The refined classical answer to this chapter's question runs as follows: quiet courage is not a lesser form of courage. It is, in many cases, the more demanding form. It operates without the structural supports that make visible courage possible: the audience, the adrenaline, the narrative arc, the social recognition. It sustains itself across time rather than concentrating itself in a moment. And it requires a particular kind of integrity, the willingness to be good when being good produces nothing, to hold a standard when no one is keeping score, to act from your values when acting against them would cost you nothing except your own self-regard. Part 2. Modern Lynn Breen Brown did not set out to study courage. She set out to study shame, the painful experience of believing that you are fundamentally flawed and therefore unworthy of connection. But the research, as good research often does, led somewhere adjacent and unexpected. To understand what protects people from shame, Brown discovered, you have to understand what allows them to be honest with themselves and with others. And that brought her, inevitably, to courage. In Daring Greatly, Brown, 2012, page 37, she documents what she came to call ordinary courage, the courage that her research subjects described again and again as the hardest thing they did, not because the stakes were dramatic but because the exposure was real. The courage to tell the truth about who you are. The courage to ask for help when asking feels like weakness. The courage to say I was wrong in a room where you are expected to perform certainty. The courage to set a limit with a person whose approval you need. None of these acts involves physical danger. None of them produces a defining moment that anyone would put in a biography. They are, from the outside, almost unremarkable. From the inside, and Brown's research is built on what people report from the inside, they are experienced as genuine courage, a real fear, a real cost, a real act of will in spite of both. In Dare to Lead, Brown, 2018, she extends this into organizational life with precision. The courage to have the uncomfortable conversation rather than send the carefully worded email that avoids the point. The courage to voice a disagreement in a meeting rather than perform agreement and complain in the corridor afterward. The courage to say I don't know when the culture of the organization rewards the performance of knowing. These acts are small in their exterior dimensions and large in their interior ones. They require the person performing them to accept a specific, uncomfortable exposure, to be seen as uncertain, wrong, limited, or dissenting in environments that often punish each of those qualities. William Ian Miller, in his searching literary and cultural study The Mystery of Courage, introduces the category of what he calls ignoble everyday courage, a term he uses not to diminish it but to distinguish it from the martial heroism that has dominated our vocabulary. Miller, 2000, page 9. Ignoble courage is the courage of the person who keeps going. Not the dramatic advance over open ground, but the grinding persistence of the ordinary person who faces difficulty that is not interesting, not documented, not the stuff of narrative. The courage to keep working when the work is not working. The courage to remain committed to a relationship that is asking more of you than you expected. The courage to get up and try again tomorrow at something that failed again today. Miller argues that we systematically undervalue this form of courage because our evaluative framework was built in and around warfare, where the visible, explosive act of bravery is the natural benchmark. Against that benchmark, endurance looks passive. Against a more honest standard, it looks like what it is, extremely difficult. The organizational research on whistleblowers makes this concrete with uncomfortable precision. Studies of people who have reported institutional wrongdoing document that the decision to blow the whistle is rarely a single dramatic act of conscience. It is, almost always, a long series of small, quiet decisions made under escalating pressure: the decision to document what you have seen, the decision to keep the documentation, the decision to report internally when you know the report will be unwelcome, the decision to go further when the internal report is ignored or suppressed. At each step, the cost is real: social isolation from colleagues, damage to professional reputation, psychological distress that can be severe and lasting. What enables these people to act is not the dramatic courage of the moment. It is the quiet, daily decision to remain committed to a standard of honesty that the institution around them is organized to erode. Amy Edmondson's research at Harvard Business School arrived at the structural dimension of this question from a different starting point. Working across hospitals, manufacturing plants, and technology companies, she documented that the quality most predictive of team learning and high performance was not intelligence, experience, or technical skill. It was what she called psychological safety, the shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. Edmondson, 2018. In psychologically safe teams, people ask questions, admit mistakes, raise concerns, and disagree with authority without expecting punishment or humiliation. In teams where safety is absent, those same acts require extraordinary individual courage to perform. Edmondson's insight is important because it relocates part of the responsibility for quiet courage. Where quiet courage flourishes, where speaking up honestly is unremarkable, where admitting uncertainty is not a career-limiting act, it does so partly because someone in a leadership position worked to create the conditions in which it could. The leader who thanks someone publicly for raising a concern, who models intellectual humility by saying, "I was wrong about that," who actively solicits dissent rather than tolerating it reluctantly, that person is not just being principled. They are making quiet courage structurally available to everyone around them. Where quiet courage is absent from teams and organizations, the costs are not merely individual. Edmondson's research shows that teams where people cannot voice concerns or admit uncertainty make more errors, not because the individuals are less competent, but because the information that would prevent errors cannot circulate. The hospital where nurses cannot challenge doctors' orders. The cockpit where the co-pilot cannot question the captain's approach. The organization where the person who sees the problem knows that naming it will cost more than staying silent. In each case, the absence of structural support for quiet courage converts an ordinary act of professional honesty into an act of heroism, and heroism is, by definition, rare. It is worth naming the psychological cost of sustained quiet courage in unsupportive environments directly. Researchers studying moral injury, the damage done to a person's integrity when they are chronically required to act against their own values, or prevented from acting according to them, document outcomes that include persistent anxiety, depression, and occupational burnout. Litz et al., 2009. The person who maintains their standards day after day in an organization working to erode those standards, without recognition, without structural support, without any confirmation that the effort is mattering, is carrying a burden with real psychological weight. This is not a reason to abandon quiet courage. It is a reason to take seriously the obligation to build environments where it does not require heroism to be honest. Reflection prompt: where in your life are you practicing quiet courage right now, without recognizing it as such? What would change if you named it to yourself? What would change if you named it to someone else? Part 3, Courage in Action. Most people, if asked to list their courageous acts, will either draw a blank or reach for something dramatic. The time they quit the job, confronted the person, made the bet that changed everything. These moments are real. But they are not where most of your courage lives. Your courage lives in the Tuesday morning when you said the thing you did not have to say. In the meeting where you declined to pretend you understood something you did not. In the month you spent maintaining a standard in a place where the standard was inconvenient and no one but you was keeping track. You have been braver than you know. The task is to see it and then to keep doing it with intention. Practice 1. Recognize quiet courage when you see it in yourself. Set aside 20 minutes this week and review the past month. You are looking for 3 acts of quiet courage you performed: the honest conversation you did not avoid when avoidance was available, the standard you held when letting it slide would have been easier and undetected, the truth you told when a comfortable silence was right there in front of you. These acts will not feel dramatic when you find them, they rarely do in retrospect, and they almost never do in the moment. Name them anyway. Write them down. Quiet courage that goes unnamed tends to go unbuilt on. When you can see the pattern, you can deliberately extend it. The acts of courage you can name, you can repeat. The ones you cannot see, you cannot consciously develop. Start by seeing. Practice 2. Create conditions for quiet courage in your team. Quiet courage does not flourish in environments where speaking up is punished or where admitting uncertainty signals weakness. This week, do one specific thing that makes quiet courage more structurally available to the people around you. Invite a dissenting view by name, not "Does anyone disagree?" but "Mira, I know you had concerns about this approach. Would you say more?" Thank someone publicly and specifically for raising an uncomfortable concern rather than smoothing it over. Acknowledge a mistake of your own in a room where people expect you to perform confidence, without softening it into a learning opportunity or a humble brag. Psychological safety is not a culture initiative or a workshop outcome. It is a set of small, repeated, specific acts of leadership. Do one this week. Practice 3. Write a letter of recognition. There is someone in your organization or your life who is practicing quiet courage, bearing difficulty with consistency, maintaining integrity without recognition, telling hard truths that no one else will tell, showing up day after day to work that is not being seen. Identify that person. Then write them a letter, not an email, a letter, on paper, in your handwriting, and tell them what you have observed and what it is meant. Say specifically what you have seen. Not "You're such a strong person," but "I watched you raise that concern in the team meeting 3 months in a row, and I know how much resistance you have faced, and I want you to know that I have seen it and it has mattered." Quiet courage is, by definition, rarely acknowledged. The recognition costs you almost nothing. To the person receiving it, it may mean more than you can calculate. Philosopher Spotlight, Seneca Lucius Annaeus Seneca, for BCE 65 CE, was born in Cordoba, rose to advise Emperor Nero, and spent his final years writing the letters to Lucilius. Seneca argued that virtue required no audience. To live with integrity in obscurity was harder, and more admirable, than performing it before crowds. His letters return again and again to endurance of illness, political danger, mortality, as courage's highest form. The test of character, he insisted, is what you do when no one watches. In 65 CE, Nero ordered his death. Seneca spent his final hours composing quietly and died with composure intact. Courage challenge, this week, notice 3 acts of quiet courage, your own or someone else's. Write them down. Then acknowledge at least one of them out loud, to yourself in your journal, to the person who performed it, or to your team. Quiet courage survives on recognition. How does courage shape leadership? Part 1, the question explored May 28, 1940. The War Cabinet Room in London. A small number of men are deciding whether Britain will continue to fight or whether it will seek terms through Mussolini, a backchannel to Hitler that, in the language of diplomacy, could be framed as negotiation and would, in the language of history, mean surrender. Lord Halifax is making the case for negotiation. He is not a coward. He is a patrician, an intelligent, deeply experienced statesman who has been navigating the machinery of British foreign policy for a decade. He is doing the arithmetic that any reasonable person would do in an unreasonable situation. The British Expeditionary Force is encircled at Dunkirk, France is collapsing, the United States is not yet in the war, and the RAF does not yet have the fighters to hold the sky. Halifax's position is not that Britain should capitulate. It is that Britain should explore whether terms exist. He is, by any measure, making a rational argument. Winston Churchill, 10 days into his role as Prime Minister, sitting at the same table, understands something Halifax does not or cannot bring himself to accept. The moment Britain opens negotiations with Hitler, even exploratory ones, even ones that go nowhere, the war is over in a way that winning it could never reverse. Not because the terms would necessarily be catastrophic, but because the signal they send to France, to America, to Germany, to the British people, is irreversible. Once it is known that Britain flinched, Britain has flinched. There is no unflinching that. Churchill ends the meeting not with a brilliant strategic argument but with a declaration. They will not negotiate. Britain will fight. No speech is delivered. No public is watching. The cameras that have preserved so many of Churchill's gestures for posterity are not in this room. What happens here is a cabinet decision in a windowless room, and it is, arguably, the most consequential act of leadership courage in the 20th century. This is what leadership courage actually looks like, most of the time, not the famous address, not the stirring broadcast, not the moment the biographers find most photogenic, but the decision in a room, without an audience, when the people around the table have good reasons for a different answer and only one person is willing to bear the cost of the right one. The ancient philosophers had much to say about this kind of leadership, and what they said was not comfortable. Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, 350 BC, 4.3, offers his portrait of the megalopsychos, the great-souled person, as something close to the philosophical ideal of the courageous leader. The word is often translated as magnanimous, which softens it into something more palatable than what Aristotle actually meant. The megalopsychos is worthy of great things and knows it. Not as a pose, not as a performance of confidence, but accurately, his self-assessment corresponds to his actual capacities and his actual obligations. He does not fear death more than he fears living dishonorably. He does not seek the approval of the many, because the approval of the many is not the standard he is working against. He acts from his own sense of what is right and accepts the consequences, including the consequence of being wrong, which is a consequence the megalopsychos takes seriously precisely because his judgments are not protected by the crowd's opinion. This is not a comfortable portrait. Aristotle's great-souled person is formidable, somewhat austere, and entirely unfashionable in an era that prefers leaders who are relatable above all else. But it is honest about what genuine leadership courage requires, the willingness to make a decision whose worth cannot be confirmed until after you have made it, on the basis of a self-assessment that no one else can verify, in the face of intelligent people who have reached a different conclusion. That is what Churchill did on May 28. It is what every leader who has ever mattered has done, at some version of that moment, in some version of that room. Plato's portrait of leadership courage in the Republic, Plato, 380 BCE, 7, runs along a different line but arrives at a related insight. In the famous allegory of the cave, the prisoner who escapes the flickering shadows and ascends to the actual light of day has undergone the philosophical equivalent of genuine education. He has seen the world as it is, not as it appears. But the vision alone does not constitute leadership. Leadership, genuine leadership, requires that the philosopher return to the cave. That he go back down, into the darkness, to the people who are still watching shadows, who will resist the account he brings, who may ridicule him for claiming to have seen something they cannot yet see, who may punish him for disturbing the comfortable consensus. The courage of leadership, on Plato's account, is not the courage to see clearly. It is the courage to go back. To take what you have understood and walk it into resistance. To lead not from the vantage of superior vision but from the obligation to bring the vision to those who do not yet have it, knowing full well that they may not thank you for it. This is why Plato's cave has never lost its relevance to anyone who has ever tried to lead an organization through genuine change. The light is not the hard part. Going back into the dark is. Cicero, writing in De Officiis, Cicero, 44 BCE, I.20, offers a claim about leadership authority that cuts directly against the assumptions of most institutional hierarchies. Auctoritas, genuine authority, is earned through demonstrated courage, not conferred by position. The title does not give you the authority. The moment of demonstrated willingness to act from principle at genuine personal cost does. Cicero's reasoning is almost the reverse of what organizational power typically assumes. We tend to think that authority enables courage, that a leader's positional power protects them when they take a difficult stand. Cicero argues the opposite: it is the difficult stand, taken at real cost, that creates the authority on which all subsequent leadership depends. People follow those who have shown, in an actual moment of consequence, that they will do the right thing even when the right thing is expensive. No title can purchase that credibility. No title, once it is demonstrated, can take it away. Marcus Aurelius, writing in private, the Meditations were never intended for an audience and were not published in his lifetime, offers perhaps the most undecorated account of what leadership courage demands day by day. He was emperor of Rome from 161 to 180 CE, and he spent most of that reign not in Rome but on the frontier, fighting the Germanic tribes along the Danube in wars he had not sought and would not live to resolve permanently. He was a Stoic philosopher who had not expected the throne and did not want it in the way that many of his predecessors had wanted it. The Meditations are the journal of a man trying, daily, to be equal to obligations he cannot put down. Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect, he wrote. Meditations, Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 CE, 6.2. The formulation is quiet. It is not a battle cry. It does not announce itself as a philosophy of leadership. But it is, leadership, for Marcus, is not a platform for self-expression or a stage for greatness. It is a service requiring daily courage, the courage to make the decision no one else will make, to deliver the news no one else will deliver, to hold the standard when holding it is unpopular, and to do all of this without mistaking the service for the self. The great failure of leadership courage, in Marcus's account, is not the dramatic moment of weakness, it is the slow, daily substitution of self-interest for the obligations of the role. He was writing to himself because he was the most important person he needed to convince. The picture that emerges from these four sources: Aristotle's Megalosychos, Plato's returning philosopher, Cicero's earned Octoritas, and Marcus Aurelius's daily service is not the picture the leadership industry usually paints. Leadership courage is not charisma. It is not boldness for its own sake. It is not the quality that photographs well at the podium. It is the willingness, in a room with intelligent people presenting reasonable arguments for a different conclusion, to say, "We will not negotiate. We will go back into the cave. We will bear the cost of the right decision. And we will do it again tomorrow." Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 6.2, Part 2, Modern Lens. The ancient philosophers described the architecture of leadership courage from the outside as a portrait of character, a topology of virtue. The modern researchers who have studied it most carefully have gone inside the architecture and returned with something that complicates the portrait without contradicting it. Brené Brown spent years studying leaders in organizations before publishing her findings in Dare to Lead, Brown, 2018, page 11. What she found, distilled from hundreds of interviews and thousands of data points, was that the leaders who created the most effective, most resilient, and most honest organizations shared four practices that she grouped under the heading of courageous leadership: rumbling with vulnerability, living into values, braving trust, and learning to rise. The first of these, rumbling with vulnerability, is the most counterintuitive and the most important. What distinguished the best leaders was not their confidence or their decisiveness. It was their willingness to be genuinely uncertain in public, to enter a conflict or a hard conversation without knowing how it would resolve, and to acknowledge, in the room, not in the memoir, that they did not have the full picture. This is not what most leadership cultures reward. Most leadership cultures reward the appearance of certainty, which is a different thing entirely, and a more expensive one than it looks. Brown's other three practices flow from the first. Living into values means that the stated values of the leader actually predict the leader's behavior when the behavior is costly, not just when it is comfortable. Braving trust means being trustworthy in the small moments of daily leadership, not just at the dramatic ones, following through, maintaining confidentiality, choosing courage over comfort in the unremarkable Tuesday meeting rather than waiting for the historic occasion. Learning to rise means that when a leader fails, and the courageous leader, who takes positions and makes bets, will fail, they have a practice for returning to themselves and to their obligations rather than collapsing into shame or deflecting into blame. Taken together, Brown's four practices are less a theory of leadership courage than a behavioral description of what it actually looks like, at the operational level, in rooms that are not war cabinets but are where leadership happens most of the time. Jim Collins, approaching the same question from a data-driven strategy perspective, arrived at a finding that surprised him. In Good to Great, Collins, 2001, page 13, Collins's research team found that the companies which had made the sustained transition from good performance to genuinely great performance were led not by charismatic, high-ego visionaries but by what Collins called Level 5 leaders, people who combined fierce professional will with genuine personal humility. The professional will is the courage part, the willingness to make hard calls, to confront brutal facts without flinching, to stay with a commitment through the long period before the results vindicate it. The personal humility is what distinguishes Level 5 leadership from mere stubbornness, the ego submission that allows a leader to give credit for success to others while taking responsibility for failure themselves, to be more interested in the right outcome than in being seen as the one who got it right. Collins's Level 5 is, structurally, very close to Aristotle's Megalosychos, accurate self-assessment in service of something larger than the self, without the inflation of ego that would distort either the assessment or the service. The most consistently underrated act of leadership courage, in both Brown's and Collins's accounts, is the conversation. Specifically, the conversation that no one else in the organization will have. The feedback that is precise instead of gentle, that says the presentation was unfocused and I need you to restructure it before Thursday rather than there are a few things we might think about tightening up. The decision reversal that admits a past mistake rather than quietly walking it back and hoping no one notices the pivot. The honest answer to the question, how are we actually doing, when the honest answer is not the one the room wants to hear. Organizations develop elaborate immune systems against these conversations. They learn to reward the leader who says the thing that makes the quarterly meeting feel good and punish the leader who says the thing that makes the quarterly meeting feel like an emergency. The courageous leader is the one willing to trigger the immune response for the sake of the organization's actual health. The research on organizational behavior consistently shows why this is so difficult. Leaders who rise through hierarchies learn, often without noticing that they are learning it, that conforming to existing norms is rewarded and challenging them is risky. Each small act of conformity, the dissenting view not raised, the honest concern swallowed before it reaches the table, the bad decision supported because the powerful person in the room wants it, is individually rational and collectively corrosive. Organizational theorists have called the cumulative result institutional cowardice, not a dramatic moral failure, not a single moment of breakdown, but the slow, steady suppression of honest judgment in favor of social survival. It is the organizational equivalent of Plato's cave, the consensus that everyone has agreed, tacitly, to treat as reality in order to avoid the cost of returning to the light. What the ancient and modern sources agree on is this: genuine leadership courage is not about grand gestures. Churchill in the War Cabinet is the exception, not the template. The daily practice of leadership courage is less visible, it lives in the meeting where the honest question gets asked, the conversation that gets had rather than postponed, the decision that is made from values rather than from the calculation of what the room will reward. The ancient sources described this as a disposition, a hexis in Aristotle's language, built through repeated right action. The modern sources describe it as a set of practices cultivated and maintained against the constant institutional pressure toward comfortable conformity. The description is different. The underlying claim is identical. Reflection prompt: what is the courageous conversation you have been postponing as a leader, the one that everyone around you already knows needs to happen? What is it actually costing you and your team to keep postponing it? Part 3: Courage in Action. Leadership courage is not a trait you either have or don't. It is a set of behaviors that you can practice, examine, and extend incrementally, deliberately, and starting this week. Here are 3 practices that follow directly from everything the ancient philosophers and modern researchers agree on. Practice 1: Map your leadership courage edge. Every leader has a zone where they are reliably courageous and a zone where they consistently retreat. You probably already know yours. The difficult financial conversation you always have clearly, directly, without softening the numbers. The performance conversation you always defer, the one where you leave the meeting having said something, but not the thing, and both you and the other person know it. The strategic disagreement you swallow when you should raise it, because the cost of raising it feels higher than the cost of living with the wrong decision. Map yours. Take a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle. On the left, the courageous acts you make without much internal struggle. On the right, the ones you consistently avoid, defer, or dilute. The right side of that page is not a list of your failures. It is your leadership development plan. The mapping itself is the first act of courage in the practice, because naming the avoidance is harder, and more useful, than describing the things you are already doing well. Practice 2: Use Brown's rumble practice. A rumble, in Brown's language from Dare to Lead, is a conversation held with the explicit assumption that you do not have the full picture and the other party might be right. It is the opposite of the conversation that most leadership cultures prepare leaders to have, the one where you enter with a position, defend it efficiently, and leave having established something. Approach the next conflict or tension in your team with curiosity rather than certainty. Enter it with a question rather than a conclusion. I want to understand what's happening from your perspective before I share mine. This is not a negotiating tactic. It is a genuine suspension of your own certainty for long enough to discover whether it is warranted. For many leaders, this is the hardest courage of all, not the courage to face an external threat, but the courage to be wrong in front of someone you lead, to discover that your read on the situation was incomplete, and to adjust without losing your authority. That authority, as Cicero would have recognized, is not damaged by the discovery. It is built by it. Practice 3. Model courageous vulnerability once this week. Choose one moment in a meeting, a one-on-one, or a team communication to share something honest that you would normally keep managed. A genuine uncertainty about a decision you have made. A mistake you have learned from and have not yet named as such. A real concern you have about a challenge the team is facing that you have been presenting is more resolved than it is. Not a performance of vulnerability, actually honest. One moment of it. Watch what it does to the room. Brown's research is unambiguous on this point. Leaders who model vulnerability create teams where honesty becomes possible. You cannot demand courageous conversations from a team you are not willing to lead into. The team reads the leader before it reads the strategy. If the leader is armored, if the leader's honesty is always polished, always managed, always calibrated for palatability, the team learns that armor is what this place requires. If the leader, once, in a real moment, says the true thing, the team learns something different. That learning travels further than any policy on psychological safety ever written. Philosopher Spotlight, Marcus Aurelius on leadership. Marcus Aurelius, 121–180 CE, became Emperor of Rome in 161, a role he had not sought. He spent most of his reign on the Danube frontier, commanding legions against Germanic tribes in wars that could not be permanently resolved. He kept writing his philosophical journal, the Meditations, throughout those campaigns, in camp, between dispatches, never intending publication. The Meditations record a man leading in conditions not of his choosing, from principles he restated daily. His theory of leadership: power is obligation, authority is service, courage is the daily refusal to let the role corrupt the person carrying it. Courage challenge: have one courageous conversation this week that you have been postponing. Before you have it, prepare, apply the Phronesis test from Chapter 5, accurate information, noble purpose, bearing your own consequences. Write down the 3 most important things you need to say, not argue, say. Then have the conversation. What is the courage to think differently? Part 1. The question explored. In the spring of 399 BCE, a 70-year-old man stood before a jury of 501 Athenian citizens and was offered a way out. The charges, impiety and corrupting the youth, were serious, but the death penalty was not inevitable. His friends and allies had floated an informal arrangement: stop philosophizing. Leave Athens if you must, but leave quietly. Stop asking your questions. Stop pressing people on whether they actually know what they claim to know, whether the things they say they value are actually worth valuing, whether the life they are living is the life that would survive examination. Do that, and you will not die. Socrates refused. The jury sentenced him to death by hemlock. He accepted the sentence with a composure that scandalized his friends and students. In the Apology, Plato's account of the trial, Plato, 399 BCE, Socrates does not plead. He does not minimize. He does not, as one of his accusers might have hoped, perform contrition he does not feel. He stands before 501 citizens of the city he loves and tells them, with the unhurried clarity of a man who has thought through what he believes and why he believes it, that he will not trade his mind for his life. The jury votes to execute him. He spends his final hours in conversation with his students, still arguing, still questioning, still following the argument wherever it leads. He drinks the hemlock, according to Plato's Phaedo, with the equanimity of a man boarding a ship for a journey he has long anticipated. The Apology is the greatest single document of intellectual courage in Western philosophy. Not because Socrates was right about everything, he was not, and not because his conduct was the only reasonable response to his situation. It is the greatest document of intellectual courage because it makes the stakes unmistakably clear. The choice Socrates faced was the starkest version of a choice that most of us face in far milder form: whether we will allow the pressure of social consequence to make us think, speak, and act in ways that contradict what we actually believe. Socrates chose death over intellectual dishonesty. Most of us are only being asked to risk embarrassment, or a difficult conversation, or a reputation for unconventionality. The hemlock clarifies the question by making the cost explicit. An unexamined life, Socrates tells the jury in the Apology, is not worth living. He means it literally. It is not an epigram. It is the stated reason he will not stop asking questions even to save his life. The courage Socrates demonstrated was not, in the classical sense, the courage of the soldier, the Andrea that Laches and Nicias debated in Plato's earlier dialogue. It was something adjacent but distinct, the willingness to let what he actually believed govern what he actually said and did, regardless of what power, or custom, or the fear of death, required him to say instead. We might call this intellectual integrity, but that phrase has grown thin with overuse. What Socrates modeled is something more demanding, the refusal to let the mind become a prisoner of its circumstances, even at the final cost. Aristotle, who spent 20 years studying under Plato at the Academy, understood this kind of courage from the inside. He was the most brilliant student Plato ever had. He was also the student who disagreed with almost everything Plato's mature philosophy had come to stand for. Plato's theory of forms, the doctrine that the objects of genuine knowledge are eternal, unchanging, non-material entities of which the particular things we see in the world are only imperfect copies, was the cornerstone of the Platonic system. Aristotle found it untenable. He argued, with meticulous patient reasoning over decades, that the forms were not separate from the things they were supposed to explain, that you could not account for a beautiful face by positing a perfect beauty existing somewhere outside the material world. The universal, he insisted, was to be found in the particular, not apart from it. This was not a minor adjustment. It dismantled the architecture of his teacher's philosophy. And it was only the beginning. On the soul, on politics, on rhetoric, on the natural world, on the nature of the good life, Aristotle built a different edifice almost everywhere. He did not do it carelessly or combatively. He did it because the argument led him there. The opening line of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, 350 BCE, I.1, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good, is, in its way, a declaration of intellectual independence. Here is where I begin, from what I can observe, not from what I was told. He followed the argument wherever it led, even when it led directly away from the man who had taught him everything he knew. That kind of intellectual courage, the courage to follow the argument against the current of received wisdom, against the weight of authority, against the pull of loyalty and habit, is what we see again and again in the history of thought at its most consequential moments. Galileo Galilei turned his telescope to the Venetian sky in 1610 and began recording what he saw. Jupiter had 4 moons orbiting it, and any moon orbiting Jupiter was, by definition, not orbiting the Earth, which meant the Earth was not the immovable center around which everything else revolved, which meant that the Ptolemaic cosmology endorsed by the Church and embedded in 2 millennia of European intellectual tradition was wrong. Venus showed phases like the Moon, which could only be explained if Venus orbited the Sun. The Milky Way, resolved through the telescope into individual stars, was not a cloud or an emanation but a vast structure of discrete lights. Galileo knew what the evidence meant. He published his Sidereus Nuncius in 1610, and his dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems in 1632. In 1633, the Inquisition forced him to his knees and compelled him to formally abjure the Copernican view. Tradition records that he muttered, rising from his knees, "E per assai move," and yet it moves. Whether or not those words were spoken, the sentiment they capture is precise. The evidence is what the evidence is. The moons of Jupiter do not cease to orbit because a court has required a man to say they do not. Intellectual courage, at its core, is the willingness to let the truth be true even when it is inconvenient, professionally dangerous, institutionally costly, or personally fatal to one's standing. Galileo was not, ultimately, a martyr in the way Socrates was. He recanted, he lived, he continued working under house arrest. But the body of observation and argument he assembled and published before his recantation exemplifies the particular form of courage we are examining, the willingness to follow evidence against the current. The Stoics gave this capacity a precise philosophical formulation. Epictetus, the former slave who became one of the most rigorous Stoic teachers, argued in his discourses, Epictetus, 108 CE, I.1, that the fundamental human capacity, the thing no external power could take from a person, was prohairesis, the governing faculty, the power to choose what to assent to. What we assent to is true, what we refuse to assent to, what we consider and reject. This is the one domain of absolute freedom that no circumstance, no imprisonment, no threat can reach. Epictetus had experienced slavery. He knew better than most philosophers what it meant for one human being to have near total power over another. And his conclusion was not that freedom is impossible but that it exists in a place the slaveholder cannot reach, in the willingness to examine one's own beliefs, to reject what is false regardless of who endorses it, and to assent to what examination reveals as true regardless of who disapproves. The Stoic practice of prohairesis requires something that most people find genuinely difficult: applying the same critical scrutiny to one's own beliefs that one would apply to a stranger's. The comfortable belief, unchallenged, becomes invisible, which means it becomes, in practice, unchosen. Epictetus was insisting that intellectual courage is not only a matter of standing against external authority. It is also a matter of standing against the authority of one's own unexamined habits of thought. This is what connects Socrates, Aristotle, Galileo, and Epictetus across their different situations and centuries. They were not contrarians. They did not hold unusual views for the pleasure of being unusual. They held the views they held because they had examined the evidence and followed the argument, and they refused, at varying cost, to let social pressure or institutional power substitute for that examination. Every major transformation in the history of science required this same willingness. Copernicus sat on his heliocentric manuscript for years before finally authorizing its publication in the year of his death. Darwin accumulated 20 years of evidence before publishing On the Origin of Species in 1859, knowing the response that was coming. Einstein held positions on the nature of time and simultaneity that struck most physicists of 1905 as bizarre. None of these were acts of defiance for the sake of defiance. Each was an act of fidelity to the evidence, to the argument, to the discipline of letting honest thinking govern what one claims to believe. Intellectual courage is not the possession of correct views. It is the willingness to think honestly, rigorously, and without flinching, regardless of where honest thinking leads. An unexamined life is not worth living. Socrates, Apology, Plato, 399 BC, Part 2, Modern Lens. The classical tradition gave us the philosophical framework for intellectual courage. Modern psychology has given us the uncomfortable data about how rare it actually is. In 1951, Solomon Asch ran a series of experiments that have become among the most cited in the entire history of social psychology. The setup was straightforward. A group of people sat in a room and looked at lines drawn on cards. One line was clearly the same length as a reference line. The participants were asked to say which one matched. In the control group, where people were answering alone, the error rate was less than 1%. The line lengths were unambiguous. In the experimental groups, however, Asch had arranged things so that all other participants, who were Confederates, in on the experiment, would give the same wrong answer before the naive participant responded. Under those conditions, approximately 37% of the naive participants gave the wrong answer at least once, conforming to the group's false consensus despite being able to see with their own eyes that the group was wrong. The implications are not comfortable. The participants were not confused. They could see the correct answer. What Asch had demonstrated was not a failure of perception but a failure of the willingness to state publicly what perception revealed. The social risk of disagreement, the discomfort of being the one person in the room who says something different from everyone else, was sufficient to suppress honest reporting in a significant proportion of ordinary people facing a trivial question with no serious stakes. If social pressure can do that with line lengths, we should be honest about what it does with ideas, beliefs, and professional judgments that carry real consequences. Rollo May, the American existential psychologist, was writing about this problem from a different angle in 1975. In The Courage to Create, May, 1975, page 13, he argued that creative courage, the willingness to bring something genuinely new into being, is the rarest and most necessary form of courage in the contemporary world, precisely because its rewards are least certain and its risks are least dramatic. The soldier who runs toward gunfire at least has a clear sense of what bravery looks like in the moment. The writer facing the blank page, the scientist sitting with an unorthodox hypothesis, the manager about to propose a direction that everyone else in the room will resist, they have no such clarity. The danger is diffuse: ridicule, irrelevance, the slow erosion of professional standing, the dull ache of being someone others do not take seriously. May's insight was that the courage to create is the courage to be seen thinking, to let something that originated in your own mind be exposed to a world that may find it inadequate or absurd. The blank page is terrifying not because nothing is there but because everything that goes on it is exposed. Adam Grant's research on what he called originals, people who generate and act on unconventional ideas, yielded a finding that has become important in organizational psychology. In Originals, Grant, 2016, page 8, Grant reported that originals are not people who feel no doubt about their unconventional ideas. They are people who feel the same doubt most people feel, sometimes more, and act anyway. The crucial variable is not confidence but the willingness to act in the presence of intellectual uncertainty. The person who has the dissenting view and keeps it private, Grant's research suggests, is not being appropriately humble. They are, in many cases, bearing a private cost, the knowledge that they had an idea and did not say it, while also imposing a collective cost on everyone who might have benefited from hearing it. Intellectual cowardice is not a private failure. It has an external price. Irving Janis's research on groupthink, Janis, 1982, gave organizational psychology its most durable account of how intellectual courage collapses in institutional settings. The phenomenon Janis identified, the tendency of cohesive, high-performing groups to suppress dissent, rationalize away contradictory evidence, and converge on decisions that no individual member, reasoning privately, would have endorsed, was most pronounced in exactly the groups we might expect to be most intellectually rigorous: expert teams, close-knit leadership groups, organizations with strong shared cultures. Cohesion and shared purpose, qualities we rightly value, turned out to have a shadow side. The more a person belonged to a group, the higher the social cost of intellectual independence from that group, and therefore the more courage it took to exercise that independence in public. The lone voice in a cohesive meeting is not simply offering a different view. They are absorbing the full social cost of intellectual honesty, at personal expense, on the group's behalf. This raises a distinction that matters. Not all dissent is intellectual courage. The willingness to hold and state unconventional views is necessary but not sufficient. What distinguishes the intellectually courageous thinker from the crank is not the unusualness of their views but their relationship to evidence. The courageous thinker holds their position because the evidence and the argument support it, and they update their position when the evidence and argument change. The crank holds their position because it is their position, because changing it would require an admission of error that the ego cannot absorb. Socrates modeled intellectual courage in part because he was spectacularly willing to be shown wrong. The entire Socratic method, the elenchus, the relentless questioning, was designed not to win arguments but to test beliefs and discard those that did not survive examination. The courage is not in holding a view. It is in holding it for the right reasons, and being willing to let it go when those reasons prove insufficient. This has immediate practical implications. Creating an organizational culture in which intellectual courage is possible requires more than permission. It requires the active removal of the social penalties that make honest disagreement costly. Janis documented cases, the Bay of Pigs planning process, the Challenger launch decision, where the warning voices were not absent. They were present, and they were suppressed, by the cost of speaking up against hierarchy, by the professional consequences controlled by those who had already decided, by the human need to belong to the group that was converging on a conclusion. Structural changes, explicit devil's advocate roles, norms around updating one's position when evidence warrants, cultures that visibly reward the person who identifies the problem everyone else was too polite to name, are not bureaucratic formalities. They are the infrastructure of intellectual courage at scale. Reflection prompt: what idea do you genuinely believe that you haven't said out loud, or haven't said fully, because of the social risk? What would it cost you to say it clearly, once, to the right person? Part 3, Courage in Action. Most of the intellectual courage failures in your life are probably not dramatic. You are probably not being asked to risk execution for your beliefs. What you are being asked to tolerate is milder but still real: the discomfort of disagreeing in public, of stating what you actually think when the room has already moved toward a different consensus, of putting an unconventional idea on paper and letting someone else read it. These are not small discomforts. The Ash experiments demonstrate that they are sufficient to suppress honest thinking in a significant proportion of people under the most trivial conditions. The question is not whether the cost is real. It is whether you will pay it. Here are 3 practices for paying it. Practice 1, the Steelman discipline. Before you dismiss a contrarian view, in a meeting, in an argument, in your own thinking, articulate its strongest form. Not the weakest version you could easily dismantle, the most compelling case for the position you disagree with, stated with the same care and precision you would want a critic to extend to your own ideas. Ask yourself, if a thoughtful, well-informed person holds this view, what is the best argument they would make for it? This practice does two things that are both worth doing. It makes you a more honest thinker, because it forces you to engage with the actual position rather than a caricature of it. And it occasionally reveals that the contrarian was right, which is, inconveniently, the most important outcome the practice can produce. The person who discovers they were wrong through a Steelman exercise has gained something real. The person who avoids Steelmaning and wins the argument on a straw man has learned nothing. Practice 2. Write one contrarian belief you hold privately, fully, without hedging. Not for publication. Not for your team, your manager, or your mentor. A page, in your own handwriting or in a private document, of the thing you actually think about some important question in your field, your organization, or your life, stated without the qualifications and soft edges you normally add to make it socially presentable. State it the way you would state it to yourself at 2 a.m, without an audience shaping the language. The discipline of writing it fully, even in private, is the first act of intellectual courage. Many people discover, doing this, that they do not actually know what they think, because they have never allowed themselves to think it without someone watching, ready to respond. The act of writing it, in full and without softening, is how you find out what your actual view is. What you do with it after that is a separate question. Practice 3. Create a minority opinion culture in your team. This week, in at least one meeting, explicitly invite dissent by name. Before the group moves to a decision, stop and say, I want to hear from whoever in this room has the strongest reservation about this direction. Not as a token gesture, not with a tone that signals the expected answer is no reservations, but as a genuine pause, with space and time for the answer to be uncomfortable. When someone speaks up, engage with what they have said seriously and in full before responding. Do not override it efficiently. Do not thank them and move on. Sit with the objection long enough that the person who raised it and everyone watching understands that the act of raising it was rewarded rather than managed. Over time, this practice changes what people believe is permitted in the room. And it changes what people actually say. Philosopher Spotlight, Socrates 470 to 399 BCE, wrote nothing. Everything we know comes through students, above all Plato, whose dialogues stage him as a relentless questioner claiming to know one thing, that he knows nothing. His method, the elenchus, asks people to define what they understand, then reveals that their definitions cannot survive examination. He applied this to generals, politicians, and poets alike. When the oracle declared him wisest in Athens, he concluded his only wisdom was awareness of ignorance. His trial and death, recounted in Plato's Apology and Phaedo, are intellectual courage made literal. He refused to stop questioning to preserve his life. Courage challenge: share one genuine contrarian view, something you actually believe but have been keeping hedged or private, with your team, your peers, or a trusted colleague this week. State it clearly, own it fully, and listen to the response without immediately defending or retreating. The goal is not to convince anyone. The goal is to say the true thing. How does courage face mortality? Part 1, The Question Explored. Rome, 65 CE. Lucius Annaeus Seneca has received the order. Nero wants him dead. The charge is conspiracy, likely fabricated, certainly convenient, but the charge does not matter. What matters is that Seneca has known this moment might come, and unlike most men who know such things and bury the knowledge in wine and distraction, he has spent decades preparing for it. He has written about death in letter after letter, not as a morbid fixation but as a philosophical practice. He has argued, in ink, that we diminish death's power by looking at it directly. Now, surrounded by weeping friends, with the imperial messenger gone and the evening settling in, he is about to test his own philosophy. Tacitus records what follows with the careful distance of a man who knows he is writing for posterity. Seneca dictates letters. He is calm. He makes cuts in his wrists, but the blood flows slowly. He is old, and his body does not cooperate with urgency. He takes hemlock. He is lowered into a warm bath, the steam meant to draw circulation to the surface. He continues talking, encouraging those around him, until the words stop coming. What those present would later describe to Tacitus was not the drama of death but the absence of it. There was no terror, no clutching, no last recantation of everything he had written. There was a man who had practiced dying every day in his writing, and who died, when the time came, the way he had practiced. It showed. This is what it looks like when courage and mortality meet, not the stoic grimace of a man suppressing his fear, but the genuine equanimity of a man who has already done the harder work of facing what most of us never face at all. The question of how courage confronts mortality is, for Aristotle, not peripheral. It is the center. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, 350 BC, 3.6, he is precise in a way that cuts against our instinct to expand courage into every domain of difficulty. Courage, in its highest and most proper sense, is about facing death. Not because death is the only thing worth fearing, there are many things worth fearing, but because death is the greatest thing worth fearing. It is the complete and irrevocable end of one's existence. Every other loss can, in principle, be recovered. Death cannot. It forecloses everything. The person who can face death for a genuinely noble cause has demonstrated, in the most unambiguous possible way, that their commitment to what matters is stronger than their attachment to existence itself. Nothing else can show this so clearly, because nothing else costs this much. Aristotle is careful not to be confused with the reckless soldier who charges the line without thinking. That man is not courageous, he has simply failed to understand what he is risking. The courageous person understands exactly what he is risking. This is the prerequisite, not the disqualifier, and faces it anyway, because the cause is worth facing it for. This is the fullest expression of the virtue. It is also why courage, for Aristotle, reaches its clearest meaning when what is at stake is everything. Plato gives us a portrait of this courage that has never been improved upon. The Phaedo, Plato, 360 BCE, is his account of Socrates' last hours, the morning of his execution, the long afternoon of philosophical conversation, the drinking of the hemlock at sunset. What is remarkable about the scene is not the nobility of it, though it is noble, but its texture. Socrates does not spend his last hours in silent heroism. He argues. He makes jokes. He comforts his weeping friends with a slightly teasing affection. He engages in sustained philosophical inquiry about the soul's nature, not because he is distracting himself from what is coming but because this is what his life has been, and it would be a strange thing to stop doing it now. The hemlock, when it comes, is not a dramatic rupture. It is continuous with everything that preceded it. Socrates has an explanation for his own composure that he offers to his friends, and it is one of the most consequential claims in Western philosophy. The entire practice of philosophy, properly understood, is a preparation for death. The philosopher has spent a lifetime attempting to detach the mind from its entanglement with the body, its appetites, its pleasures, its fears, in order to attend to what is genuinely real. Death is, on this account, the completion of that project. To have spent a life practicing philosophy is to have spent a life practicing for this. The fear of death, Socrates suggests, diminishes when one has lived in genuine relationship with what the fear is ostensibly protecting. The Stoics who came after Plato took this insight and made it deliberately systematic. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the 2nd century CE to himself, for the Meditations were never intended to be published, which is precisely why they are so honest, returns again and again to the fact of death as a tool of philosophical clarification. His formulation in Book 4 is the most concentrated expression of the Stoic position. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 161-180 CE, 4.17 Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. This is not, it must be emphasized, a counsel of despair. Marcus is not suggesting that one dwell on mortality in order to feel its weight. He is suggesting the opposite, that the deliberate, honest acknowledgement of death's reality functions as a solvent for the false urgencies and petty resentments that normally fill a human life. Most of what we treat as important, the slight in the meeting, the delayed recognition, the rival who is doing better than us, reveals itself as trivial when held against the genuine fact of our finitude. The practice of memento mori, remember that you will die, is a corrective tool. It is how the Stoics kept their attention on what genuinely warranted it. Seneca, in his letters to Lucilius Seneca, 65 CE, letter 77, articulates the positive case even more forcefully. Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. The point is not that death is coming, everyone knows death is coming, but that knowing it and living from that knowledge are entirely different states. The person who has genuinely accepted their mortality is a different kind of person. They live with more intention, more selectivity about where their time and attention go, more willingness to have the difficult conversation and say the true thing and take the brave action, because they have stopped telling themselves they will do these things later, when they are more comfortable, when the moment is better. For Seneca, the acceptance of mortality is not the beginning of a grim reckoning but the beginning of genuine freedom. Aquinas adds a dimension that the classical pagan authors did not have access to, the concept of martyrdom, which is for him the supreme act of fortitude. In the Summa Theologica, Aquinas, 1274, IIAE 123 Quetzales, he argues that death is not, in fact, the greatest evil. The loss of virtue is a greater evil than the loss of life. The person who denies what they most deeply know to be true in order to preserve their physical existence has made a catastrophic exchange. They have saved their body and destroyed the part of themselves that makes a life worth living. The martyr who accepts death rather than betray what is genuinely good has understood something that most human beings spend their lives arranging not to understand: there are worse things than dying. Living in sustained violation of your deepest convictions is one of them. Aquinas' martyr is not performing nobility for an audience. They have arrived, through genuine moral clarity, at a point where the alternative to dying is simply not available to them, not because death holds no terror, but because the other option holds more. What the classical tradition gives us, assembled across 5 centuries of Greek and Roman and medieval thought, is a picture of courage and mortality that runs exactly counter to our instincts. We tend to think of death as the thing that renders courage moot. You are dead, the question is settled, the courage was either there or it was not. The classical thinkers argue the reverse. Death awareness is not the end of courageous territory. It is its generating condition. The person who has genuinely reckoned with their mortality, not managed it from a distance, not processed it as an abstraction, but truly accepted it as the shape of their own life, is a person whose courage is no longer provisional. They are not brave when it is convenient. They are brave when it matters, because they have stopped confusing the permanent with the temporary. Think of yourself as dead. You have lived your life. Now take what's left and live it properly. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations, 4.17, Part 2. Modern lens. The classical thinkers were working from a tradition that was largely, though not exclusively, aristocratic and martial. Their paradigm of courage and death was the soldier, the philosopher, the martyr, figures whose confrontation with mortality was, in some sense, their public role. The modern contribution to this question comes from a different direction, from psychology, from clinical work, from the systematic study of how ordinary people in ordinary circumstances navigate the knowledge that they will die. Paul Tillich, the German-American theologian writing in the early 1950s, provides the first major bridge. In The Courage to Be, Tillich, 1952, page 3, he argues that the deepest form of courage is what he calls self-affirmation in the face of non-being, the willingness to exist fully, to commit oneself to one's own being, against the anxiety that the possibility of non-being generates. This is not courage about any particular threat or occasion, it is the ontological courage that underlies all other courage. It is what makes possible every act of bravery in a specific situation, because it is the prior act of choosing to be fully present in a life that might, at any point, cease. The person who has genuinely confronted the fact of their mortality and chosen to live fully anyway is practicing, in Tillich's framework, the most fundamental form of the virtue. Every specific act of courage that follows flows from this first one. Viktor Frankl's contribution comes from a different source of authority, not philosophical argument but lived extremity. In the camps at Auschwitz and Dachau, Frankl observed what happened to human beings when everything that normally sustains a sense of meaning was systematically stripped away. Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl, 1946, page 66. The prisoners had no privacy, no autonomy, no security, no future they could plan toward. They were surrounded by death of others, and their own death, which was neither predictable nor avoidable. In this environment, Frankl noticed a pattern. Those who survived psychologically, not necessarily physically, because physical survival was finally a matter of chance, were those who maintained a relationship with meaning. They found or kept reasons to care about something beyond their own survival. They maintained their dignity, their responsiveness to beauty, their capacity for care, in conditions explicitly designed to eliminate all three. Frankl's most frequently quoted observation is this: everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way, man's search for meaning. Frankl, 1946, page 66. What is less often noted is that this choice, in the camps, required sustained courage. Not the dramatic courage of defiance was usually fatal, but the quieter and more demanding courage of maintaining one's inner life in the presence of extinction. To continue caring about something. To refuse despair as a response to objectively despair-inducing conditions. To choose, each day, to be a person of a certain kind, rather than a thing being done to. This is what Frankl means, and it is precisely the Stoic position translated into the 20th century's most extreme conditions. The psychological research has since confirmed what both Frankl and the Stoics intuited. Terror management theory, developed by Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Piskzinski, Solomon, Greenberg, Piskzinski, 1986, begins from the observation that human beings are unique among animals in our knowledge of our own mortality. We know, from some point in childhood, that we will die. This knowledge generates what the researchers call mortality salience, an ambient awareness of death that shapes virtually all human behavior, usually without our conscious awareness. When this awareness is brought to the surface by a near-death experience, a frightening diagnosis, the death of a peer, people respond in predictable ways. They become more defensive of the worldviews that give them a sense of meaning and symbolic continuity. They become more hostile to those who challenge those worldviews. They seek symbolic immortality through legacy, through religion, through identification with groups that will outlast them. They manage the terror, in other words, by constructing elaborate systems of meaning that make death feel less total, less final, less immediately threatening. Courage, in this framework, means something specific and demanding. It means looking directly at what almost everyone manages not to see clearly, and choosing to live fully in its presence rather than constructing an elaborate structure of avoidance. The Stoic who practices memento mori is not being morbid. They are, in the language of terror management theory, refusing the unconscious management strategies and choosing instead a conscious relationship with the fact of their mortality. This is harder, and it is also, the research suggests, transformative. Irvin Yalom's clinical work with patients facing death makes this transformation visible at the individual level. In Staring at the Sun, Yalom, 2008, page 35, he documents what he calls awakening experiences, moments when mortality becomes undeniable and a person is freed, temporarily and sometimes permanently, from the small concerns that normally occupy their attention. Terminal patients described, with a consistency that Yalom found striking, that the months after their diagnosis were among the most alive of their lives. They stopped attending meetings they had always attended out of obligation. They had conversations they had been postponing for years. They said the true thing, made the courageous call, spent time with the people they actually loved rather than the people they felt they ought to see. The urgency of genuine mortality had stripped away the false urgencies, and what remained was a life more accurately aligned with what actually mattered. What Yalom adds to Frankl and the Stoics is a clinical observation: you do not need a terminal diagnosis to access this clarity. The Stoics were right that the awakening can be manufactured deliberately, through practice, through memento mori, through writing, through sustained and honest engagement with the fact that this day is finite and irreplaceable. The patients who experienced it spontaneously had it done to them by circumstances. The insight itself, that mortality, genuinely faced, clarifies rather than diminishes, is available without the emergency. Ancient and modern converge here on a point that remains persistently counterintuitive. Contemplating death does not make life feel smaller. It makes it feel larger. The fear of death, when it operates unconsciously as terror management theory describes, shrinks a life. It drives us toward the comfortable, the familiar, the defended. When it is brought into consciousness and genuinely faced, it does the opposite. The courage to face mortality is not a grim stoicism. It is a path into more intentional, more fully inhabited, more genuinely courageous living. Reflection prompt: if you knew you had 1 year left, what courageous act would you finally take, and what does your answer tell you about what you are currently postponing? Part 3, Courage in Action. The classical and modern traditions have been saying the same thing for 2.5 millennia, and the practice has been the same: face death honestly, and let that honesty reorganize your life. 3 practices follow from this directly. They are not comfort exercises. They are tools for reorganizing what you attend to and how you spend what you have. Practice 1, Memento Mori, a morning practice. Each morning, before the day fills up with its appointments and obligations and small anxieties, take 60 seconds. Say it plainly: I will die. This day is a finite and irreplaceable portion of my life. What matters most today? The Stoics used this practice not to feel the weight of mortality but to feel the lightness that comes when the trivial is correctly identified as trivial. 60 seconds of honest reckoning, done before the day begins, arranges your attention in the right order. The difficult conversation you have been postponing matters. The resentment you have been nursing does not. The project that is genuinely aligned with what you care about matters. The impression you are managing in front of someone whose opinion you do not actually value does not. This is not an anxiety exercise. It is a calibration. Do it for a week and notice what shifts. Practice 2, the deathbed test. When facing a significant decision, especially one that involves a choice between what is comfortable and what is right, apply the deathbed test. Imagine yourself at 90, looking back at this moment. Which choice would you be proud of? Which would you regret? This is not a morbid exercise. It is exactly what Seneca was doing every day in his letters, using the perspective of the end of life to clarify the priorities of the present one. The deathbed test does not always point toward the dramatic or the grand. Often it points toward the honest, the present, the faithful, the acts of quiet courage that compound over a lifetime and constitute, at the end of it, a particular kind of person. The test will not always tell you to take the bold action. Sometimes it will tell you to apologize, to stay, to slow down, to keep faith with what you said you valued. Let it clarify. Practice 3, write your own eulogy. Take a page, handwritten, private, unhurried, and describe the courageous life you want to have lived. Not your accomplishments, your character. Not what you built, what you were. Who benefited from your courage? What difficult things did you do anyway? What did you refuse to compromise on, even when the compromise would have been easy and no one would have known? Read it. Then ask the only question that matters: is the way I am living today building toward the person described on that page? The gap between who you are and who you intend to be is not a source of shame. It is your agenda. It is the specific, actionable, entirely personal account of what your courage is actually for. Philosopher Spotlight. Seneca. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, for BCE is 65 CE, was a Roman Stoic philosopher whose letters to Lucilius constitute antiquity's most sustained meditation on mortality. Seneca argued that anticipating death is not morbidity but its opposite, the precondition of full living. He called this melody thanatou, the daily rehearsal of dying, reviewing each day as if it were one's last, balancing life's accounts before sleep. His letters insist the person who has made peace with death is the only free person. His death in 65 CE, ordered by Nero, became the living proof equanimity cultivated across decades, demonstrated at the end. Courage challenge: write one page, the courageous life you want to have lived. Not your achievements, your character, your integrity, your choices. Read it every morning for 1 week. On the 7th day, identify the single most important courageous act that, if you took it, would most close the gap between the life you are living and the life on the page. What is the legacy of a courageous life? Part 1, the question explored. Marcus Aurelius never published the Meditations. He wrote it in Greek, not Latin, the language of his court, in private notebooks, on campaign, in the years of the Danube Wars when the empire was under pressure from every direction. He did not title it. He did not share it. As far as we know, he intended no audience but himself. The Meditations is a private practice journal, a man talking to himself in the dark about how to be better tomorrow than he was today. He has been dead for 1800 years. The book has not been out of print since it was first published. It changed the lives of countless people he never met, in languages that did not exist when he was alive, in circumstances he could not have imagined. This is the paradox of a courageous legacy: you cannot aim at it. You can only aim at being good, with courage, for reasons that have nothing to do with how you will be remembered. This is not a comfortable thought for an age that has turned legacy building into a genre of self-help. We are surrounded by the vocabulary of intentional legacy, brand, platform, impact, footprint. We are told to build something that outlasts us, to write the narrative of our lives in advance, to be the authors of what comes after. There is something admirable in this impulse. The trouble begins when the legacy becomes the aim, rather than the life. When the performance of virtue substitutes for its practice. When we spend more time imagining the tribute at the memorial than doing the unremarkable daily work that would actually deserve one. The philosophical tradition on legacy is long, surprisingly consistent, and almost entirely at odds with the modern brand-building instinct. Its central argument is simple enough to state in a sentence, but demanding enough to spend a lifetime on: pursue virtue, not recognition, and the recognition, if it comes, will mean something. Pursue recognition without virtue, and you will likely achieve neither the recognition you sought nor the character that would have made it worth having. Aristotle opened the Nicomachean Ethics with the claim that every human action aims at some good, and that there is a highest good, eudaimonia, usually translated as flourishing or happiness, that is the proper telos, the end, of a human life. Aristotle, 350 BCE, I.7. The courageous life, on Aristotle's account, does not produce legacy as its product, it expresses eudaimonia as its nature. A life of genuine virtue is its own complete answer to the question of what a life is for. Aristotle was not indifferent to reputation. He understood that the good person typically earns the esteem of other good people, and that such esteem is a genuine component of the flourishing life. But he was precise about the order: first live well, recognition follows, if it comes, as a consequence of the life, not as its purpose. To reverse that order, to seek the recognition first in hope that virtue follows from success, is to fundamentally misunderstand the causal structure of a good life. The Stoics took this argument and made it almost mathematically sharp. Marcus Aurelius, in the very notebooks he never intended for publication, stated it with the quiet directness of a man who had been emperor long enough to know how little the emperor's approval meant in the end. Perfection of character is this: to live each day as if it were your last, without frenzy, without apathy, without pretense. Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, 161-180 CE, 9.28. The Stoic case rests on a structural observation about the relationship between virtue and reputation. The person who pursues virtue will leave a genuine legacy, because genuine virtue, courage practiced consistently, honesty maintained under pressure, justice upheld at personal cost, tends to reshape the lives it touches. The person who pursues legacy often achieves neither, because the pursuit of reputation is a performance, and performances, however polished, do not produce the same effects on the world that actual virtue does. You cannot fake the kind of courage that changes another person's life. You can fake the kind of courage that changes your follower count. Plato had explored the same question from a different angle, in the myth of air that closes the Republic and in the argument of the Phaedo about what remains when the body is gone. Plato, 380 BCE, X. In the myth of air, souls who live justly and courageously are shown choosing their next lives from a position of clarity. They know what matters because they have paid the full cost of genuine virtue, and they choose accordingly. The souls who had lived for pleasure or reputation alone, by contrast, are shown choosing badly again, repeating the errors of the life they had just left. Plato's point is not confined to his metaphysics. The soul correctly oriented toward what is genuinely good, the soul habituated to courage and justice through actual practice, carries that orientation with it. It knows how to choose. The soul that has spent its life performing virtue for external audiences has not developed the internal faculty that right choice requires. Cicero brought the question out of metaphysics and into politics, and his own life gave him an authority on the subject that no philosopher writing comfortably in the Agora could claim. He wrote De Officiis in the last months of 44 BC, after Caesar's assassination, when the republic he had spent his career defending was effectively over and his own death was becoming increasingly probable. Cicero, 44 BCE, I.22. The great statesman's legacy, he argued, is not a monument but a republic left in better order than he found it, institutions strengthened, norms upheld, the common good placed consistently above personal advantage. Cicero wrote his final work as a final act of civic instruction, knowing that his audience would have to carry forward what he could no longer protect. He was killed by Mark Antony's soldiers a few weeks later. His influence on Western political and moral thought outlasted by 2,000 years the empire that killed him. He had, in those last months, done exactly what he said a statesman ought to do, placed his actual conduct, the writing, the argument, the refusal to surrender his position above any calculation about his fate. The legacy was real because the courage was real. What the classical tradition offers us, in the end, is not a theory of how to be remembered. It is a theory of how to live, and a quiet confidence that genuine living, lived with genuine courage for genuine purposes, will matter in ways we cannot predict or control. The courageous life does not produce legacy the way a business produces a product, according to a plan, on a timeline. It radiates legacy through the lives it touched, the courage it modeled, the standard it sets simply by existing. A courageous life inspires courage in others. This is virtue's most profound gift, it is contagious. Not through imitation, exactly, but through something more fundamental, through the permission that one person's genuine courage gives another person to take their own fears seriously and act anyway. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. B1. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations Part 2, Modern lens. The classical philosophers argued their case in the abstract, or nearly so. What modern research has added is evidence, specific, accumulated, hard-won documentation of what courageous lives actually leave behind, and how the leaving happens. The evidence, when you assemble it from psychology, leadership research, and the study of meaning, points in the same direction the ancient argument did. But it adds a texture to the picture that Aristotle could not have had. Brené Brown's concept of wholeheartedness, the subject of a decade of research into what distinguishes people who report a genuine sense of love and belonging from those who struggle, is, in effect, a modern name for the courageous life. Brown, 2012, page 10. Wholehearted people, in Brown's data, live with full presence, full honesty, and full engagement. They have set aside the armor that keeps them from being seen in the performance, the perfectionism, the preemptive self-deprecation that protects the ego at the cost of genuine connection. And the legacy of a wholehearted life, in Brown's telling, is not an achievement list. It is the quality of presence that rippled outward, the people who felt genuinely seen by someone brave enough to see them honestly, the relationships built on honesty rather than strategic self-presentation, the organizational culture shaped by a leader who refused to pretend that everything was fine when everything was not. You cannot produce this legacy intentionally. It is what you leave behind when you were genuinely there. Viktor Frankl gave us the sharpest formulation of why this kind of legacy is permanent in a way that reputational legacies are not. Writing from within the specific hell of the Nazi concentration camps, and, crucially, observing from within them, Frankl made a claim that has the quality of lived proof rather than philosophical argument. Meaning created through courageous action is permanent. Frankl, 1946, page 76. Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. The meaning made by acting courageously when it was genuinely hard is woven into reality. It happened. It is done. Its effects continue in ways you will never fully trace in the person who watched you hold your ground and found, from that watching, the nerve to hold their own. Reputations can be revised, monuments can be torn down, records can be expunged. The actual courage actually exercised cannot be undone. It is a fixed point in history, however small. Alastair MacIntyre's argument about virtue in narrative adds a structural dimension that the more personal accounts do not quite reach. MacIntyre, 1981, page 187. MacIntyre's thesis was that virtues are intelligible only within a narrative, the story of a life, a community, a tradition. Courage isolated from its story, courage as a performance, courage as a branding decision, is unintelligible as virtue because it has been severed from the purpose that makes courage meaningful. But courage embedded in a coherent life story, a story that can be told, recognized as genuine, and passed on, is the substance of which real legacies are made. The courageous life is, among other things, a good story, one in which the protagonist faced real difficulty, understood what was at stake, and chose well, not just once but across time, with a consistency that became recognizable as character. That story survives its protagonist because human beings need such stories and recognize them when they encounter them. Howard Gardner's research on leadership and legacy identified the same pattern from a different direction. The most enduring legacies in leadership, he found, are not strategic plans or organizational structures. Gardner, 1995, page 43. They are stories and values that survive the leader's departure, the way a team, years later, still references what a former leader stood for, still invokes the standard she set, still asks the question she trained them to ask, is this right, or are we telling the truth here? Courage, consistently modeled, the difficult conversation held, the uncomfortable truth stated in public, the refusal to pretend that the numbers said something they did not say, becomes a culture's vocabulary for difficulty. It gives people a word for what they should do when they are afraid. It gives them a model. And models, in human learning, work with a depth that no instruction manual can match. This is the question that leadership legacy, finally, comes down to: what courageous culture did you build? What difficult truths did you tell that became the organization's standard? What conversations did you refuse to avoid, and by refusing to avoid them, made it safer for others to be honest? What did you model when it cost you something, when the honest answer was the expensive one, when the right decision was the unpopular one, when staying in the hard conversation was harder than leaving it? These questions outlast the title. They outlast the tenure. They are the actual questions that the people who worked with you will ask, some of them years later, when they face a moment that resembles one you faced, and they need to know what to do. Reflection prompt: what would it mean for your life to have been courageous? What would the people who knew you best say about how you faced difficulty, upheld your values, and showed up for what mattered? Are you living in a way that makes that eulogy possible? Part 3: Courage in Action. The philosophers have given you the architecture. The researchers have given you the evidence. What remains is the work, and the work, in the end, is not philosophical. It is the specific, daily, unglamorous practice of acting with courage for reasons you believe in a direction you have chosen, whether or not anyone is watching. Here are 3 practices for turning the question of legacy into something you do this week. Practice 1: write your courage legacy statement. 1 sentence. Not a mission statement, a declaration of courageous intent. I intend to be the person who tells the truth in difficult rooms. I intend to be the leader who does not manage people, who develops them. I intend to be the parent who models courage for my children by being honest about my own fears. Write it. Put it somewhere you will see it: the top of your journal, the lock screen of your phone, the corner of your desk. The sentence is not a promise about outcomes, it is a commitment about conduct. It says, when I am in that kind of moment, this is the kind of person I am trying to be. What you actually leave behind will be shaped, more than anything else, by whether you lived consistently with it, not perfectly, but consistently, and honestly when you fell short. Practice 2: identify the one courageous act that would most define your legacy. Not the most dramatic, the most genuine. The thing that, if you did it, would close the gap between who you are and who you intend to be. The conversation you keep postponing. The project you have not started because you are afraid it will fail and the failure will confirm something you are not ready to have confirmed. The truth you have not told because the relationship might not survive it, and living with the lie has become the easier form of cowardice. Name it. Write it down. Give it a date. A legacy is not built in a single heroic act, but there is often one act, unperformed, that shadows everything else, that sits at the back of every room you enter and watches while you do the smaller, safer things. Naming it does not require you to do it immediately. But naming it, honestly, is the first act of the courage that doing it will eventually require. Practice 3: invest in another person's courage. Find someone who was standing where you were 10 years ago, facing something you have already faced: the first difficult conversation with a board, the first serious creative failure, the first time they discovered that doing the right thing was going to cost them something real. Mentor them. Share your failures as honestly as your successes: the specific fear, the specific choice you made or failed to make, the specific cost and what came after. Nothing transmits courage more effectively than a true story told without the flattering edits. The courageous life is not a solo performance. It is a tradition, passed from person to person, each generation making it slightly more possible for the next to be brave, because they have seen that someone who looked approximately like them faced approximately this and did not dissolve. You are the proof of concept for someone who needs one. Act accordingly. Philosopher Spotlight. Marcus Aurelius, 121–180 CE, ruled the Roman Empire for nearly 2 decades while writing philosophy in private. notebooks he never titled or published. He spent his reign defending borders he would not fully secure, governing an empire that would not long survive him. The Antonine succession ended with his son Commodus, one of Rome's worst emperors. And yet the Meditations, the private journal of a man only trying to be better, became one of the most widely read works of philosophy in human history. The Stoic principle proved itself: pursue virtue, not recognition. Recognition followed 18 centuries later. Courage challenge: write your courage legacy statement, one sentence, stating the courageous contribution you intend to make with your life. Then share it with one person who will hold you accountable to it. Not a social media post, a conversation. Tell them what it means, why it matters, and what you are afraid of. Ask them to ask you about it in 30 days.